300 years ago, fate presented itself in the land of nowhere. Secret kingdoms and dungeons sprang up in number to accompany them. Numerous powerful demons came and proclaimed the apocalypse for humanity. But all was not lost because the Awakeners emerged. Class changers possessed formidable power that helped them defeat those beasts and save the world from near destruction. To fight monsters, the class changers continued to explore the secret realms for riches and materials. Nations began to work hard to cultivate these class changers, allowing everyone to wake up at 18 years old. The day came to wake up a class for students who turned 18 years old. To awaken a class 1, you had to touch a blue magic crystal. Several students touched the crystal. One of them was named 1WA from the third year of class 2, and he failed to wake up a class and was labeled as a student without class. Another student named Laigwa from the third year class successfully awakened the swordsman class, and another named Wangao from the third year class successfully awakened the craftsman class. Awakenings were generally divided into 3 categories: combat, support, and creation. According to its class, the combat category was the most desired by all, while the creation category was the least desired, and considered the weakest, and despised by all. Several more students touched the glass, and one with purple hair became happy when the combat category called Magic Swordsman awakened. On the other hand, another student became sad and began to cry because he had awakened the category of creation. He wondered why he had managed to awaken this class that was not good for combat. After the awakening ceremony was completed, the class ranks were also divided, generally into 4 categories: common, secret, and divine. Among them, the divine rank could only be seen once every 100 years. It was the turn of our protagonist, Jian Chen, to touch the glass and awaken a class. As he did so, the glass began to emit a powerful light. Seeing this, the other students were astonished. A brown-haired boy pointed at Jian Chen and told everyone that he was the prodigy of the academy. Another student informed the others that it was a wake-up call. As Jian Chen touched the crystal, it began to emit a powerful light that rapidly advanced towards the sky. Students began to wonder what rank this class would have. Several thought it might be a divine class, since the city hadn't produced a divine talent in hundreds of years. In a matter of seconds, the glass began to emit a powerful light that formed a giant tree in the sky, visible from every corner of the city. It was said that every time a class of divine rank awoke, a phenomenon occurred that could shake the heavens and the earth. Several seconds later, the awakening of the class was successful, and while Jianchen touched the glass with one hand with the other, he reached into his pants pocket and simply looked at the sky. At that moment, the director appeared. Huang approached Jianchen and congratulated him on being the pride of the school. Although he knew that Huanchen could awaken a combat class, he didn't expect him to awaken a divine class. After saying this, Principal Huang asked Huangchen what class he had awakened. Huangchen turned his head slightly towards the director, and was a little surprised with a smile. He explained to Principal Huang that the class he had awakened was not a combat class. Upon hearing this, Director Huang was left in shock. With a surprised expression on his face, he began to look at Jianchen. Seeing that Jianchen had not awakened a combat class, he asked him if he had awakened a support class then. Jianchen turned his body towards him and extended his hands to his sides, and plants made of spirits appeared in the palms of his hands. He revealed to everyone that he had awakened the divine rank creation class called Spiritual Master. He also added that this talent was intended to help with the growth of plantations and small creatures. Hearing this, both the director and the others were surprised with a look of surprise. They started to look at Huangqing and explained that this was bad because the creation class didn't have combat skills. Then, even of divine rank was considered useless. The teacher who accompanied the headmaster, Huang, asked Huang Chen not to be discouraged, since although he could not fight, at least he could be safe. He explained that spiritual teachers were quite popular in the field of research. He also added that the recommendation he had promised was no longer possible. He advised Jian Chen to enter the field of research, since a professor could get him a letter of recommendation just before the professor could finish speaking. Jian Chen interrupted, turned his head toward him, and thanked him with a smile. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, and, as he walked away from the teachers, explained that he had something to do. One of the students started laughing and told his classmate that this was a farce, since he had thought that Huangchen had obtained some kind of divine combat class, but it turned out to be just a creation class. The other student put his hand close to his face and told his friend that life is full of surprises. He also added that everyone thought they were fleeing. The academy prodigy would awaken a fighting class, and now it didn't matter how much he excelled academically. it would be considered useless. Huan Chen put his hands in his pants pockets and began to head towards the exit while the nearby students mocked him. One of the students told the others that this was quite fun to watch, since Huan Chen had been the king of hard work since he entered the academy. Another student told the others that he had worked so hard, just to end up getting a creation class. Another student told the others to read the beauty of the school that always remained. Second, he had awakened a secret combat class. Hearing so many jokes, Huang Sen simply smiled, and thought that those two students had been very cruel to him a moment ago. He hadn't expected waking up to a class of creation to change things so drastically. Thinking about this, he had no doubt that in this world, only strength mattered. He began to wonder what was wrong with the creation class, so he reached out, and a system window appeared over the palm of his hand. According to the system notification, Huang Cheng had successfully completed the awakening of his class. He had awakened the class called Divine Rank Spiritual Master, and the conditions for opening the Natural Calamity Insect System had also been met. With the initial insect mother unlocked, Huang Qin turned his head to one side, and while looking at the system window, he couldn't help but smile, thinking that this class was perfect for him. Our protagonist's name after dying was reborn in this awakened world after the Dark Age ended. The whole world was filled with various monsters and dungeons. It was from that day that this world began to respect the strong. He had been reborn as an orphan to survive in this cruel world. Despite having nothing in this world, he gave everything. Before he turned 18, he thought he would have to rely on his own abilities to make a living. To his surprise, a month ago, on an ordinary day, a system window appeared in front of him to inform him that the Insect Calamity system would merge after the class woke up, and the system would be activated after a successful transfer. Who put his hand on his chin, and as he looked out the system window, thought that the race of insects that had once devastated humanity during the Dark Age was an extremely powerful race. I had heard that the last time a natural calamity occurred, 9 of the 12 kings of the human race were sacrificed to seal it. He clenched his fist tightly and thought that in this world, strength was everything. There was nothing to doubt. He stared at the system window as his body emitted a powerful energy. He thought that as long as he could use the strength of the insect race for himself, the insect race would have no chance against him. Without thinking more, Huan Chen activated the system, and upon doing so he was teleported into the system. He began to look around and felt somewhat confused. He began to look forward, put his hand close to his head to cover his eyes, and thought this was his own sea of consciousness. In front of him was a great spiritual tree. Seeing this, Huan Chen began to wonder if this was his talent. I didn't expect it to be a tree. More windows of the system appeared. Huan Chen had several classy talents. These talents were evolutions of all things, and sacrifice was required. They could be used once every 10 days, and were limited to 1 use per target. The first talent was called the Fruits of All Things. Through sacrifice, Huan Chen could advance the fruit growth progress, and a special fruit could fall randomly. The second talent was called Enhanced Growth. Stability allowed him to increase the growth rate of living beings. Currently, this ability increased the growth rate by 10%. By using this ability, Hu could accelerate the growth of all living things, and the duration of the reuse time was 8 hours. Hu Chen put his hand on his chin while looking at the system window. He thought this system was good, as he had even proactively analyzed his talent. Although these talents seemed to lack combat skill, every one could be applied to your system. While he was distracted, a system window popped up asking him if he would like to start summoning Mother Insect. Without hesitation, Jian Chen asked the system to summon Mother Insect. At that moment, an evil energy began to emerge from the ground, and a system notification window appeared to inform him that the insect mother was being summoned, while whoever looked at the energy thought that the insect mother had a strong presence. Several seconds later, another system window appeared to inform him that the summoning of the natural calamity rank insect mother called 9 miasma wings had been successfully completed. The mother of insects was a gigantic creature. She began to look at Huyan Chen, who took several steps back, and was amazed. The insect mother status window appeared. It was called 9 wings of miasma from the abyss. She was known as the sovereign of death. Once as a calamity, it caused a catastrophe as big as a natural disaster and then disappeared. During the Third Age, her current devour value was 0%. Jian had 100% affinity with the mother of the insects. Jian had to proceed with the devouring and start creating the next generation of bugs to unlock abilities. The insect mother approached Jian, who was astonished, and began to wonder why it was so huge. The insect mother began to look at Jian and addressed him like a teacher. He introduced himself as Little Nini, and explained that he was very hungry, and wanted to devour ferocious beasts. Another system window appeared to inform him that the mother insect's growth rate had increased by 10%. Now Jian could use a sacrificial object to enhance this objective. The first upgrade would not consume any sacrificial items. Thanks to his talent, Jian raised his head slightly, and while looking at the system window, he thought that now that he didn't need to use a sacrificial object, there was no time to waste. Without hesitation, he asked the system to improve Mother Insect. The insect mother's body began to envelop itself in a powerful green light, and as Jian watched this, he thought that she needed to devour to level up, so it wasn't going to be easy to please her. The insect mother's body began to emit a powerful aura, and quickly Jian assumed an offensive stance. Little by little, the insect mother began to evolve and take the form of a human woman. Several seconds later, the insect mother successfully evolved. His body began to emit a powerful aura. He had white hair and battle armor. With a murderous gaze, he began to stare at Gihan. He slowly began to move towards Gihan, and a system window appeared above his head. The queen of the new plague had gone through a life transition and leveled up. Along with leveling up, he gained new skills. The first skill was called parenting. With this ability, I could share the experience 10 times with the host. The second ability was called poisonous mist. With this ability, he could transform into my deadly asthma that corroded everything. The third and final skill was called communion. This ability allowed him to boost all the host's abilities by 20%. Seeing the insect mother's shape, Jian was surprised. The insect mother gathered momentum and lunged at Jian to embrace him. She explained that the little girl had not evolved. Jian was a little confused, since he didn't know what was happening. He turned his head slightly towards her and couldn't help but blush when he saw that the insect mother had evolved into a human form. She stopped hugging Jian and he began to stroke her head. She closed her eyes, clenched both fists, and referred to Jian as a teacher. With a smile, he explained that the little girl did not want to devour flesh and blood. As Jian stroked his head, a status window appeared above his head. His name was 9 Wings of Miasma, and he had 4 abilities: Poisonous Mist, Feed Fury, and United. Currently, its devour value was 0. Once the devour value bar was filled, it could start spawning offspring. He had 2 passive abilities called Experience and Attribute Enhancement. While Jean stroked the little girl's head, Nu began to look at her stats window, and thought that the spiritual master talent could speed up the insect mother's devouring growth, as well as her experience growth, which in turn would speed up her own improvement. In addition, the insect mother was able to increase all of her attributes by 20%. John's class and this system were a perfect match with this. He didn't need a kind of combat. He extended his hands to the sides and a lot of insects began to come out of the palm of his hands. He turned his head toward the Great Spirit Tree and thought of what the system message had just mentioned: insects, abyss, a catastrophe as great as a natural calamity. Combined with this incomplete information, it was clear that this was not something that could be easily shown to others. Being discovered could lead him to his perdition. He put his hands in his pockets, and while looking at the spirit tree, for now he decided to use his class identity as a creation. And my insect mother's poisonous asthma abilities to devour monsters and increase their concealment were not Jian's style. He wanted to become strong enough to show his abilities to the world while he was lost in his thoughts. The water of the Sea of Consciousness began to stir. Seeing this, the mother insect quickly jumped up and began to fly. As they both stared at the water, Jian explained that this could only mean one thing. At that moment, with a murderous look, the insect mother turned her head back and attracted Jian's attention. As she looked back, he began to smile and explained to Jian that he sensed a threat. At that moment, Jian left the system space, and when he saw what he had in front of him, he was surprised. In front of him stood a man much taller than he was. This man had black hair, beard, and a scar over his eye. The man approached Jian and began to look him in the eyes, remaining for several seconds. The man asked Jian if the awakening phenomenon that the whole city had seen before had been activated by him. While Hu was looking at the man, he clenched his teeth tightly and realized that he was at least of master rank or higher. The guy became alert and wondered why they were looking for him. While the man was staring at Jian, his body began to emit a powerful green aura. People were approaching, and although the guy was quite far away, they could feel his strong aura. They wondered what level of awakening he was seeing that he was talking to Jianchen. They began to question whether there was any kind of conflict. The man began to fix his eyes on Jian's, and seeing this, Jian became a little nervous, since this guy had been pressing him for some time without saying a word, and he didn't know if he was being tested. At that moment Mother Insect appeared. While licking his finger, he approached Jian with a murderous look at the man and told Jian that this guy was a threat to him. To her, the guy looked delicious and she wanted to devour him. Jian panicked and knew something was wrong. His suspicions were not bad, as several system warning windows appeared. The insect mother had detected a threat to Jian. The system considered the guy to be a big bite, and the mother insect was about to start devouring him. Jian's powerful aura began to expand everywhere. He quickly realized that something was wrong, because now little Nina had detected a threat and was about to attack. His powerful work reached the students who had previously mocked him. They began to cover their faces, wondering why Jian had such a cold and sinister aura. Jian flared with a murderous gaze, began to fix his eyes on the man's. He realized that when the devour value was low, the aggressiveness of the mother insect increased. To prevent this from happening, she needed to find some monsters for little Ni to devour as soon as possible. Seeing the powerful aura that Jian emanated, the man simply began to smile, and seeing the man's smile, Jian quickly realized that he wanted to test his strength, but unwittingly activated the insect mother. The good thing was that Jian could still suppress the insect mother. Without hesitation, Jian deleted it, and a window appeared. The system had temporarily deleted the insect mother, and her devour value was low so that this would not happen again. Jian had to start devouring and raising the mother insect as soon as possible. While the man had his hands in his jacket pockets, he began to stare at Jian, and couldn't help but congratulate him. Although Jian had just finished his awakening, he was already able to face the man's trials and even fight back. The man told Jian that he was worthy of a divine awakening, and also added that his future was limitless. Jian just sat in silence listening. He was relieved that he hadn't been discovered. He approached the man and, as his eyes locked on hers, asked him who he was. The man began to smile. Then he held out his hand and introduced himself as Hyegan. The leader of the Night's Watch admired Jian's strength and asked him if he wanted to join them. Hearing this, Jian was surprised, since he had not expected Jian to be part of the Night's Watch. The Night's Watch was an organization specially commissioned by the Great Sea to resist demons and hordes of beasts. Whenever there was a wave of beasts, or a new secret kingdom or dungeon spawned, the Night's Watch would always be the first to investigate or eliminate them directly. Because of the constant fighting on the front lines, the death rate of the Night's Watch was extraordinarily high and most people avoided it. But for Jian, it was different. The insect mother needed to continuously devour the flesh and blood of monsters, to accumulate devouring value and produce offspring. Currently, Hu needed a chance to face big monsters, and once the devour value was completed, the mother insect would start to breed, and no one knew how much stir it would cause. For this reason, the wild nature was a good place to raise the mother insect. If anyone joined the Night's Watch, either by devouring or breeding, the risks they posed could be easily dealt with. While Hu looked at Jiagan's hand, couldn't help but smile, since the organization of the Night's Watch was perfect for him. The students started saying that the Night Watch had a high mortality rate. Most didn't even go there, so the students thought Jiancheng wouldn't join the Night Watch. Hearing this, Jian forced a smile on Jiani. He told her that all the rumors about the Night's Watch were a thing of the past. To prevent Jian from rejecting the offer, Jian told him that as long as he was willing to join, he would receive full training due to his divine rank. Their resources were very valuable to the Night's Watch. Without thinking twice, Jian shook Jihagangi's hand and called him leader, telling him that no further explanation was necessary. Jian began to fix his eyes on Jiangans and told him that to restore the glory of the Night's Watch, his generation should not shirk their duty. After saying this, he explained to Jiangan that he was willing to join the Night's Watch. Hearing this, Jiangan felt somewhat confused. What he didn't know was that Jian planned to depend on them for the mother insect's rearing. Jiangan was surprised, and asked Jian if this was true. Just before Jian could answer his question, the insect mother appeared, and started sending system notification windows. Jian was furious, and explained to Jian that she was not happy about it because she wanted to eat the man. After saying this, he began to tell Jian that he was very hungry. Hearing this, he got nervous, closed his eyes and told Jian that what he was saying was true. After saying this, he left with the excuse of having an important task to do. He began to walk away from Jagan, slightly turned his head towards him, said to God with his hand, and told him that in 3 days he would be punctually present at the Night Watch headquarters. Jagan simply turned his head towards him and stayed in. Maybe he thought this was going to be more complicated. I didn't expect it to be so simple. He had forgotten to ask Jian what hidden profession he had at that moment. 2 men fell from the sky and landed near Jiagan. One of them was the 8th elder of the martial arts academy. Jiagan turned his head toward them and told the old man that if he was here to snatch people from the Night's Watch, then he was too late. The old man asked Jiagan where the guy who had awakened from the category of creation with divine rank was. Hearing this, Jiagan felt somewhat confused. He turned his head to the old man and asked him what he was talking about. The old man approached Ili. With a surprised expression, he asked if he planned to let an awakened divine rank of the creation category join the Night's Watch, only to die. Hearing this, Jian realized that Jian had the category of creation with divine rank. At the same time, Jian headed for the city. A man named Uncle Huang asked him if he had been responsible for the phenomenon in the main city. Jian said yes. A woman with purple hair approached Uncle Guang. He put his hand on her waist and asked her to lower her voice, or she could die if someone looking for trouble arrived. Uncle Huang put his hand behind his head, closed his eyes and started laughing. He told her he was always talking non-stop. Who approached them? He closed his eyes and with a smile reassured Uncle Huang by telling him that this was nothing shameful. Uncle Huang turned his head to Chejan and told him that although the creation category could not fight, he had heard that companies always cultivated spiritual plants that needed people from the creation category. He told Jian that if his parents were here, they'd be very proud of him. Over the years, Jian had managed to survive thanks to the support of everyone who lived in the same building as him. With a smile he told everyone that he would not forget them in the future. Uncle Guang asked him not to worry about those little things. He also added that Jian had arrived at the right time, as they were about to go to a secret beginner-level kingdom to get some equipment. Uncle Guang wanted Jiang to join them and level up together. Jian accepted the proposal and thanked Uncle Guang. At that moment, a message appeared from the system because he had completed the team formation. Several minutes later, Jian and the others stepped through the portal and into the secret realm. While Jian had his hands in his jacket pockets, he began to look around and wondered if they were really inside the secret realm. At that moment, the torches of the secret realm were lit, because the coincidence had been completed. All the monsters inside began to look at Jian and the others. This secret realm, called the Temple of the Dead, was rank 6. It was currently open. The secret kingdom guaranteed a 100% drop rate for objects and equipment. Experience points would be calculated after completing the secret kingdom. To voluntarily give up half was to give up both the experience and the team. Tiawan became a little nervous when he realized that these monsters were undead soldiers. He began to wonder why the secret kingdom system had paired them with a dungeon of this level. Jun began to look at the undead soldiers and realized that this secret realm was not going to be easy to deal with. A purple-haired girl approached them and explained to Uncle Guang that since Jian was an awakened one of divine rank, the celestial system had assigned them a secret realm of a higher level. Uncle Guang turned his head slightly towards her and reminded her that Jiang Cheng had awakened in the category of creation. The girl, with brown hair, also approached Uncle Guang and, while looking at the undead soldiers, asked him why they did not leave this secret kingdom. Just before she could finish speaking, Uncle Guang interrupted her, started to draw his sword, and told everyone that there was no problem, since they didn't encounter secret kingdoms of this level every day. He also added that this time, thanks to having Zhan with them, they would get lucky and get some great equipment items. Seeing Tiawang draw his sword, the undead soldiers enraged Tiawang. He gained momentum and advanced towards the monsters. He asked Zhan to move away a little, since these undead soldiers were more dangerous than rank monsters. Average. Uncle Huang asked Zhan to stay behind as they advanced toward the core of the dungeon. First, Uncle Huang attacked one of the undead soldiers with his sword, giving him a hard blow on the head. He turned his head back and asked Sayusai to quickly improve his talent. Hearing this, Sayusai put his hands together and activated his power, making Uncle Huang's talent improve thanks to this improvement. Uncle Huang ended the life of the monster, an undead soldier. While Uncle Huang and the others fought, Hans just stood watching from afar. He began to wonder if they fought monsters every day just to survive. Thinking about this, he had no doubt why they always came back covered in wounds. Although Sayosa and she had always supported him. I had heard that she had become an adventurer because she had been forced to heal her brother's eyes while looking at Uncle Wang and the others. She thought about becoming stronger quickly, and when she earned money properly, thanked them. While he was distracted, the insect mother began to manifest. She put her hand under her chin, and while looking at the corpse of the undead soldier, she told Hu that there were many monsters and blood here, and that she wanted to devour them. While Hu had his hands in his trouser pockets, turned his body towards the corpse of the undead soldier, and began to smile. He thought Lito Lin had already spotted the body. Given this situation, Hu decided to test Lito's abilities first. The Lion extended his hand to the side, and used the level poison barrier ability, called Corrosion, in La Palma. From his hand appeared a mist of poison, and ordered Lito the Lion to devour the corpse of the undead soldier. She thanked him, and the poisonous mist began to advance towards the corpses, and slowly began to devour them. In a matter of seconds, the corpses of the monsters began to disappear. Jian realized that the corpses of the monsters corroded as soon as they came into contact with the poisonous mist. After seeing this, Jian had no doubt that Lito Line's poisonous mist was very powerful. After Lito Line devoured the corpse, the devour value increased to 10 points. The level of monsters was too low, which made the growth rate slow, so Lito Line needed to devour more monsters. While Jian had one hand in his pocket, he slightly turned his head back and thought that Uncle Huang and the other two were truly companions who had been working together for years. In such a short time, they had already advanced into the depths of the dungeon. Since Poisonous Mist was an area ability, and Jian still couldn't control it precisely, there could still be accidental injuries. To avoid this, Jian decided to follow Uncle Guangdi and the others from behind, and take care of the monsters' corpses. At that moment, Little Mine caught his attention. He told Jian he felt something. Jian turned his head to one side and saw more monsters begin to emerge from the ground. Little Minnie told him he felt coolness and blood in that direction. These monsters were level 10 shadow hunters. They had strength of 20 points, agility of 15 points, defense of 10 points, and endurance of 5 points. These monsters lurked in the shadows to hunt down the weakest stragglers. While Jian was looking at the shadow-stalking monster, he began to wonder if his name was in red, because his level was much higher than his. However, in terms of attributes, these monsters were completely inferior to Jian, who had the skill enhancement united. A stats window popped up with Jian having a devour value of level 1. His identity was the Insect Lord. His occupation was Divine Rank Spiritual Master, and he had 3 level 1 talents called Growth of All Things, Divine Evolution, and Ancestral Tree of All Things. Jean possessed the insect mother named Little Line, also known as Wing of 9 Miasms. He had a natural calamity level, he had no equipment, he had 35 points in strength, 31 in agility, 27 in endurance, and 20 in constitution. His combat power score was 41 stars. He currently had 2 passive active abilities called Experience, Return, and Attribute Enhancement. The current devour value was 100, and the current experience was 0. Jian decided to test his skills, extended his hand to the side and gave him 9 breath, the order to transform into a poisonous mist and follow him. She heard him and turned into a poisonous mist that began to stick to the ground. At that moment, the monsters called Shadow Hunters began to rapidly advance towards Jian. He brought his hand to her face, and as his hand released the poisonous mist of Lito Line, he began to stare at the monsters. Several seconds later, he began to run toward them. Seeing this, the monsters tried to attack Jian, but he dodged their attacks, and in the process touched their bodies with his hand, infecting them with the poisonous mist. The monsters began to look towards the part of the body where Jian had touched them, and seeing the poisonous mist they were confused. While Hu was looking at the monsters, extended his hand towards them. Then he clenched his fist tightly and began to smile. At that moment, the poisonous fog, a crime in 9s, became thicker, and slowly began to corrode the bodies of the monsters, gradually destroying them. Who simply turned their heads towards the monsters, and continued to watch in silence. At that moment, several system windows appeared and he obtained 200 special price, while whoever was looking at the monster corpses thought that they were no match for him. He began to smile as he saw that the devour value was also increasing rapidly. While Liton was lost in his thoughts, Nini appeared, and reported that more blood food had appeared. Behind them more monsters began to appear. Shadow Hunters. Jian simply put his hands in his pockets and remained silent without making any movement. Then he turned his head towards the monsters, and while staring at them, he worried about Uncle Huang and the others as he realized that there were many more monsters hidden in this dungeon than they thought. he decided to quickly finish off these monsters to go see how Uncle Huang was doing, and the others, he asked Lito El Nines if he would be able to deal with the monsters. Little by little, she began to manifest through the poisonous fog. She admired the monsters, reached out to them and asked Jian to leave them with her. To her, all these monsters were small prey. After a few minutes, Hu reached where Uncle Wang and the others were. When he arrived, he realized that Uncle Wang was quite injured. The two of them were surrounded by monsters, with Uncle Wang gripping the sword with both hands, and Zhao Yi beside him ready to defend himself with his skills. The monsters were advancing rapidly towards them, and Uncle John, the blood from his wound dripping down his face, clenched his teeth tightly as he explained to Zhao Yi how complicated each confrontation became. At that critical moment, an undead soldier gained momentum and quickly headed towards Uncle Juan with the intention of attacking him by surprise. As Uncle John stood firm with the sword in one hand and looked at Zhao Yi, he felt the presence of the undead soldier and began to wonder what was happening. He quickly turned his head towards the monster and seeing his sword quickly approaching his head, he clenched his teeth tightly and thought this couldn't end well. Just at that moment Jian appeared, extended his hand towards the monster and used Little Nine's poisonous mist ability. Just before the undead soldier's sword impacted Uncle Guan, the poisonous mist adhered to his body and began to run slowly, destroying him in the process. As the body of the undead soldier disappeared, little by little, Uncle Huang turned to Huang, surprised and confused at the same time, wondering what was happening at that time. Jian asked Uncle Huang and the others if they were okay. Hearing Jian's voice, Uncle Huang turned his head towards him and when he saw Jian, he clenched his teeth tightly and was speechless. As Jian slowly approached them, he extended his hand to the side and used Little Nine's poisonous mist, infecting the undead soldiers and destroying them in the process. Even though the undead soldiers were being eaten away, little by little Uncle Guang turned towards Jian holding the sword in one hand. She stared at him and asked him like an awakened creation class. Since he could do that, Jin stopped in front of Uncle Guangi while his body emitted a powerful energy, turned his head towards him and explained with a smile that he had a hidden ability called Poisonous Mist. After saying this, he extended his hand to the side and used Little Nine's Poisonous Mist ability again. Seeing that Uncle Wang was injured, Jiang asked Cao Ji and Cao Yi Lai to quickly take him to the secret kingdom portal. He also added that he planned to stay behind to cover them. Hearing this, everyone was speechless. With a surprised look, Uncle Wang began to look at him and told him that even though Jian possessed a divine class, this was too dangerous. Cao Yi also started to look at Jian with a surprised expression and asked him to join them instead of staying here fighting the undead soldiers. As they spoke, Cao Li simply put his hand close to his mouth and remained silent. He already turned his back on them and while his body emitted a powerful energy, he slightly turned his head towards them and assured Uncle Huang not to worry because he would not have any problems. After saying this, Jian turned his back on Uncle Huang and the others, and while his body emitted a powerful energy, he slowly began to approach the monsters. At that moment, the system notified everyone that, due to the number of people who met the requirements in the last level of the Secret Kingdom, the head of the Secret Kingdom was being summoned. While Uncle Guang watched Fiang move away from them and toward the monsters, he tried to stop him, but just before he could speak, Cao Yi interrupted him. She turned her head towards him and reminded him that Jiang was not a reckless person, so she asked him to trust him. After much consideration, Uncle Guang decided to trust Jian. He tossed the sword to her and told her not to forget to return it. Then, upon hearing this, Qian extended his hand and grabbed the sword, assuring Uncle Huan not to worry, that he would return it. Later. This sword was called the Novice Conqueror Sword. He had 25 speed, 30 strength, and a 2% attack speed bonus. He also had a passive ability that was already active. Who brought the sword to his face and glared aggressively at the monsters. For him this was great because now he could increase the attack range of the poison mist. With Uncle Guan's sword he activated the poisonous mist, causing it to slowly emerge on the blade of his sword. The undead soldiers gathered momentum and tried to attack Jian, but in the blink of an eye, Eleva gave her attacks, and using Uncle Juan's sword, cut the monsters into pieces, infecting them with the poisonous mist in the process. These monsters were no match for Jian, as he was the best swordsman in the entire school. While Jian was distracted fighting the undead soldiers, a much stronger monster gathered momentum and began advancing towards him at great speed. The monster drew its sword and, as it slowly approached Jian, prepared to attack him by surprise. Although Jian did not initially feel the presence of the attack, once he turned his head to one side, he saw the monster approaching at great speed. Jian gathered momentum and took a great leap, dodging the monster's attack and sending his sword striking the ground. The monster's attack was so strong that it even shattered the ground into pieces. Seeing that Jian had dodged the attack, the monster began to look at him with a murderous look. Then he tightened his grip on the sword and, seeing it in the air, struck again. Fortunately, Jian managed to block the attack in time using Uncle John's sword. However, due to the difference in strength, the sword that Uncle Huang had lent him broke in half, causing Jian to be thrown backwards. Quickly, Jian stepped on the ground and managed to stop his moving body. Then he turned his head to one side and saw that Uncle John's sword had broken, and he was surprised. This boss was stronger than I'd imagined. Huan was more worried about the sword than the boss, since he didn't know how to explain to Uncle Huan that his sword had broken. The head of the secret kingdom was called Dead Kingdom and was level 15. The Dead Realm stood up holding the sword in one hand and began to stare at Jin with a murderous gaze. At that moment, the body of the Dead Kingdom began to vibrate, and in the blink of an eye, it appeared behind Jian, and prepared to attack. Realizing the presence of the Dead Realm, Jian was filled with terror and wondered how the chief had moved so fast. Jian turned his head towards the Dead Realm, and while looking at him with an aggressive look, he called out to Little Nile. Just before the sword of the Dead Realm could strike Jian, Little Nile appeared and grabbed the blade. He began to stare at the Dead Kingdom and asked Jian if he could eliminate it. Without hesitation, Jin said yes. Hearing this, Little Nile became happy, and using only his hand, he broke the blade of the kingdom's sword. Dead to pieces, he extended his hands to his sides, and his body began to emit a powerful energy that began to move in all directions. Seeing this, the Dead Kingdom became alert. Now that he had lost his sword, he decided to attack using his fists. Taking advantage of Little Nile's distraction, the Dead Kingdom began to rapidly advance towards her, with the intention of attacking her by surprise. At that moment, Little Mine opened her eyes and her body changed drastically. With a murderous look in his eyes, he began to look directly at the Dead Realm and used his tentacles to defend himself. He took an offensive stance and using his tentacles, began to attack the Dead Kingdom with a series of blows. Its tentacles were as sharp as swords. Little by little, its sharp tentacles began to destroy the body of the Dead Kingdom. First he cut off his left arm and then his right, and finally he cut off his head. He thrust the tentacle into the Dead Kingdom's head. Then he turned, and the chief's body fell to the ground. He took the head of the Dead Kingdom in his hand, and while his body emitted a powerful energy, he began to approach Jean. Seeing how powerful it was, Jean couldn't help but smile. He couldn't believe Little Mean was so calm in front of a head of the secret kingdom. He thought that now that the boss was defeated, the portal would open. Little Mine gained momentum and landed near Jian. At that moment, an energy crystal appeared in front of him. As he stared at the crystal, he began to wonder what the energy crystal was. It began to rise in the sky and slowly began to extract magic from the corpses of the monsters. Seeing this, Xian was astonished. Several seconds later, the energy crystal began to glow, causing a giant monster to appear. This monster was called Undead Tyrant, and it was 20 times bigger than Little Minajan. With a murderous gaze, the Undead Tyrant began to stare at Jian and Little Line. Seeing the crystal transform into a monster, he began to wonder if the energy crystal was the true leader of this secret realm. Jian turned his head back, gritted his teeth tightly, and ordered Little Line to destroy the energy crystal inside the Undead Tyrant. As the monster stared at Jian, it began to roar. The monster hit Little Line with a mass, but in the blink of an eye, she gained momentum and propelled herself off the wall, dodging the attack. Seeing that he had dodged the attack, the Undead Tyrant prepared to attack again. He attacked Little Line once more, but she gained momentum and made a great leap into the air, evading the attack in the process. This caused the mass of the monster to hit the ground and shatter it. While Little Line was in the air with a murderous look on his face, he began to stare intently at the Undead Tyrant, and then extended his hands towards him, causing sharp tentacles to rapidly advance towards him. It began to attack the boss with its sharp tentacles, but he dodged all the attacks as if nothing had happened. Seeing that the Undead Tyrant, being such a big monster, could move at such speed, Jian was surprised, clenched his teeth tightly, and began to think of a plan. Looking down, he saw several plants among the rubble. Seeing this, he decided to take advantage of it and use his class of divine creation called Spiritual Master. He began to stare at the plants and thought he had only one chance. The Undead Tyrant lifted the mass off the ground, and gained momentum for Jian. He was like a raging bull that had become uncontrollable, but that was also a latent weakness. Neen tried to attack the undead tyrant with his sharp tentacles, but he began to rotate his body at great speed and dodged them effortlessly. Gaining momentum, began to advance quickly towards Jian. Several seconds later he made a great leap. Jian raised his head towards the undead tyrant, and as he stared at him, he thought this did not look good. I'd felt it before. There were many hidden roots under the ground. While the undead tyrant was in the air, he grabbed the dough with both hands, and as he moved swiftly, that Jian prepared to attack. As Jian watched him slowly approach, he decided to use his talent the moment he was close enough, and that would stop him dead several seconds later. Once the undead tyrant was close enough, who started staring at him and decided it was time. He reached down and a green symbol appeared. In it he used his talent, and gradually the spiritual roots hidden under the ground began to emerge. Who turned his body toward the undead tyrant and, while giving him a deadly look, extended his hand toward him. In a matter of seconds, 4 spirit roots emerged from the ground and attacked the undead tyrant, cutting through him in the process and leaving him trapped in the air, unable to move. As Who had his hand extended towards him and his body emitted a powerful work, he began to look at Little Mine and told her that now was his turn. In the blink of an eye, Little Mine reached the undead tyrant. She put a hand on his head. There, as she prepared her claws with the other, she looked at him with a murderous look and answered Jian with a learned teacher. Realizing that Little Nile was ready to attack, his expression changed drastically as he realized that something bad was about to happen. He tried to defend himself, but it was in vain. Just before he could make a move, Little Nine gained momentum and using its sharp claws and tentacles, attacked him, splitting him in half and destroying the spiritual roots in the process. In a matter of seconds, the corpse of the undead tyrant fell to the ground, while whoever had his hand extended towards the sky and controlled the spiritual roots began to look at the corpse of the undead tyrant and couldn't help but feel proud. He had managed to defeat the undead tyrant, who had enough skill, as long as he used his skills properly, to play a big role in battles. While he was lost in his thoughts, a system notification appeared to inform him that the growth acceleration was in reuse time for 8 hours. Because of this, little by little the spiritual roots began to disappear. Several seconds later, the core emerged from the corpse of the undead tyrant. Seeing this, Jian decided to break it immediately. Just before the core could fly away, Jian approached and grabbed it with his hand. Then he clenched his fist tightly, shattering it as the core fragments gradually fell to the ground. Jian began to look at his fist with an aggressive look and thought this was the end. At that moment, several system notifications appeared congratulating Jian on clearing the secret realm of Rangos, the so-called Temple of the Undead. The system began calculating the contribution and a few seconds later successfully generated the Secret Kingdom's score. Jian Chen. Whoever was at level 0 and had the Spiritual Master class, got an S rating in this secret realm. Guang Yi, who was at level 12 and had the Swordsman class, obtained a Lugan rating. A level 11 World League obtained a ranking, while Ji Qin, a level 10 boxer, obtained a ranking B. The celestial system began to generate team rewards, causing a window to appear in front of Jian. After a few seconds, the system successfully generated team rewards by lengthening the window. Jian had several weapons to choose from: a dagger, a scepter, a heavy axe, a light axe, and a hammer. While the spiritual roots slowly returned to the ground, Jian stared at the system window lost in his thoughts, put his hand in the system window and grabbed the dagger. Once he pulled the dagger out of the system, his stats popped up. It was the Veloz Mall rank dagger that granted 50 attack points to the user, and a 5% speed bonus. This dagger was related to swords, and granted 2 professional attributes. Jin held the dagger with one hand while checking the blade with the other. He thought it was good and decided to use it as compensation for Uncle Juan looked to the side, and while looking at the system window, he thought there was a lot of equipment. It didn't take him long to realize that the whole team was combat-oriented. I wasn't sure if there was anything suitable for creation classes. He went to the system window, reached into the system, and decided to take a look at each team's attributes. He grabbed the hammer from the system window, and once he took it out, the hammer hit the ground, because it was so heavy. This hammer was called King's Call. It granted 100 points of strength to the user, and subtracted 100 points of agility due to its weight. The attribute of this weapon was that the user had a 10% chance of triggering 5 times more critical damage, while whoever tried to lift the hammer off the ground, began to feel a new sensation. A notification window appeared to inform you that experience points were being awarded. Seeing this, he quickly realized that the system was giving him the experience points he had obtained in this secret realm. Although the hammer was very heavy, thanks to experience, Jian was gradually able to lift it. In a matter of seconds, he was able to lift the hammer as if it were nothing. Another system notification appeared to inform him that the bonded ability was in effect. Now, all of Jian's attributes had increased by 20%. While his body was surrounded by powerful energy and he lifted the hammer with one hand, he put the other hand in his pants pocket, and flipped down. Mother Insect's passive ability had reached level 6. In this way, the effect of the united skill was also more prominent. He also realized that physical combat ability increased along with level. While he was lost in his thoughts, the little lines approached him, grabbed his shirt and caught his attention by hearing his voice, who came out of his trance. She turned her head to Ely, pointing at the system window. With a finger he asked if he could eat all that. As a reward, he put the hammer on the ground, turned his head towards her and, looking into her eyes, reflected for several seconds. Then he turned to her and told her that Lalito the Mine couldn't eat the equipment, since it was for Uncle Wang and the others to exchange it for money. He also added that if Lalito the Nine ate it, then he would have a stomach ache. Hearing this, she placed a hand behind his back. There, touching her lips with the other, she began to look at Jian with a sad expression. Then he turned his body toward the corpse of the undead tyrant and asked Jian if he could devour it. He had completely forgotten about the chief's remains, that the devour value was precious and could not be lost. While his body was surrounded by a powerful aura, he turned his head towards the corpse of the undead tyrant and gave permission to Lalito the Lion to devour it, since it belonged to him. Without hesitating for even a second, the Nini approached the corpse of the undead tyrant, which was gigantic. While Hu looked at his corpse, he began to wonder if this boss wasn't a little too big due to his large size. If Little Minnie was using the poisonous mist to corrode him, then it might take some time. Little Minnie spread his hands to his sides, closed his eyes, and opened his mouth to tell Gian he was going to dig. At that moment, his body began to vibrate and in a matter of seconds he returned to his natural shape once back in his original form. He fixed his murderous gaze on the corpse, opened his mouth, and approached him. Although the corpse of the undead tyrant was gigantic compared to the natural form of the insect mother, it was tiny for her. Seeing it return to its natural form to devour the corpse, Jian froze, opened his mouth there, as he quickly advanced towards the chief's corpse, began to roar, devoured the corpse creating a strong gale in the process. Jian took advantage of this and removed all the equipment from the system window. Holding the hammer in one hand, he covered his face with the other. The roar of the Litanine was deafening, but fortunately they were in the secret realm. If this had happened in the main city, they would have been discovered no matter how many were hiding. Once he finished devouring the corpse, a system notification appeared, granting Jian 400 devour points. As Jian covered his face with his arm, he realized that the devour value was increasing rapidly. Predictably, he thought, the chief's meat had a different value. You realized they needed to eat more monsters, boss, to increase the devour value. While he was deep in his thoughts, someone approached when he heard footsteps. John turned quickly and gritted his teeth as he saw Uncle Guang and the others approaching from the noise the Litanine had made. The current devour value was 8,876 points. He approached the Litan line and asked her to return to her other form quickly. Hearing his command, she smiled and responded with an understanding master. It was a shame for Jian that the devour value was so close to being filled. Several seconds later Uncle Guang and the others arrived. Seeing the equipment on the ground, Uncle Guang realized that Jiang had passed the level. Jian explained to Uncle Huang that he had broken his sword, but had given him the dagger in return. Without hesitation, Uncle Huang took the dagger and seeing that it was a rare object, he told Jian that he would not blame him for damaging his equipment. Sayo Saiz approached Jian and explained that the necklace was also a rare object that could sell for a lot of money. Jikan asked him how the hell he had defeated the chief. Only Jean put his hand behind his head and replied that his poison seemed to be more effective against monsters like that boss. After saying this with a serious look, Hu lowered his gaze to the ground. The secret realm had been cleaned perfectly, but once cleared it would not refresh again. Getting the return value from another boss should be enough to start breeding the bug swarm. If Jean wanted to find a new boss, he had no choice but to go to the desert. Uncle Juan looked at Jian and told him it was a shame he was the research department. Although he wasn't even level 1 yet, he could already defeat a monster. Boss told him that in the future, if Jean leveled up, he would be strong. After saying this, he asked him what his plans were, who turned to Eli. With a smile she explained that she hadn't told him before for fear of worrying him, but she was actually preparing to join the night's watch. Hearing this, Uncle Wang was shocked, and asked if he really intended to join the night watch. Xian put her hand on his head and responded that she did. She revealed to them that she was going to go to the night watch in 3 days. Before leaving, he wanted to increase his level, so he planned to head to the desert soon to continue leveling up. Hearing this, Uncle Wang stood in shock and Jinkan put his hand to his mouth. Unable to believe that Huang would do something so dangerous, Sayozai extended his hand towards him, and, looking into his eyes with a serious expression, explained that the desert was very dangerous. Just before she could finish speaking, Jian interrupted her. He clenched his fist tightly, causing the poisonous mist of breath, the nine, to begin to emerge in his palm. With his hand he asked Sayozai not to worry about him, since he knew what to do. Instead of worrying about him, he asked them to worry about those monsters. That same day, a few hours later, Jian boarded the train and arrived at the outskirts of the city. The conductor asked those going to the desert to get off the train. Jian beneath the train wore a cloak so as not to attract attention. He looked to one side and stood for several seconds. Ahead of him was a bridge full of wakefuls. Since the system had awakened, Jian's appetite had increased. The most scandalous thing is that, despite not being very stable, there was a slight increase in its devour value. When eating he took out a bread and while eating it, its devouring value increased. Little Neem manifested herself, put her hand near her mouth and while looking at the bread with an unpleasant expression, she told someone that her food was not tasty. Upon hearing this, Hu decided to find something to eat for Little Neem, so he extended his hand and made a map appear, opened the map and started looking at it with Little Neem. He didn't expect Uncle Wang to give him most of the equipment. He not only gave her the map, but also an important storage ring and a map. After he knew he was going to the desert, these things came in really handy for Jian. He started across the bridge. According to Uncle Wang, the desert was influenced by the power of the heavenly way and all electronic devices would be disrupted. It was almost like an apocalyptic scenario where monsters constantly migrated to their nests. These maps had an extremely short use time. Without the latest intelligence it was difficult to find groups of monsters, much less bosses. The Fire Phoenix and Thunder Rhino were the most common and were easy to spot when they moved. It was said that this place marked with a it should be avoided, as it was a very dangerous nest with a higher risk. According to Uncle Wan, this most Mora of Gavlins was the most suitable for him, since it had a low level, enough monsters, and fewer people. While Hu was looking at the map he clenched his fist and with a smile decided to go. Since with a map in hand I could find it quickly. While he was lost in his thoughts, someone caught his attention and ordered him to stop. Hearing this, Jian became alert and turned to see who it was. A cloaked man put his hand on Jian's shoulder and looked at him aggressively. She had been calling him all this time, so she asked him why he was pretending not to hear him. "I just wanted to ask you something." He asked Jian if he'd seen a girl with golden hair around here. Jian turned to him, and with a murderous look answered no, and also advised him to watch what he said at that moment. Little Nim's poisonous mist began to emanate from her shoulder and clung to the man's hand. He quickly removed his hand from Jian's shoulder and got a little confused. Looking at his hand, he gritted his teeth and began to wonder if this was poison. He didn't know how that could be possible, as Jian didn't seem to have reached level 10 yet. However, Jian couldn't hurt him, as the man was a level 27 main defense warrior. Jian turned and, as he walked away, advised him to hurry and find a healer, since his poison must be difficult to cure. He also advised her to take care of her brain. After saying this, he said goodbye to the man. Hearing this, the man couldn't help but get angry, caught Jian's attention and asked him if he had given him permission to leave. Hearing this, Jian turned to him and began to look at him with a murderous look. The man approached Gihan, and while his body emitted a powerful aura, he looked at him with a murderous look, and asked him how he dared to lay his hand on the Soi family. Upon hearing this, Hu began to wonder if he was referring to the Soi family in the Battle of Heaven. Continuing with our story, our protagonist, upon hearing the words of the Chongai, began to stare at him and soon realized what was about to happen. His suspicions were true. The man was trying to hit him with all his might, but unfortunately for him, Chong had already anticipated it. He simply gathered momentum and jumped to the side avoiding the attack, causing the man's fist to impact the ground, shattering him to pieces. As Chong was in the air and moving away from the man, he put his hand in front of his face and with an aggressive look he began to stare into the man's eyes and wondered what the hell the Seal family was. Seeing the man's attitude, Chong realized that it was not normal. the man was very angry, clenching his teeth tightly, and while looking at Chong with a murderous look, he began to approach him at great speed. He drew his sword, and couldn't help but praise him for being fast enough. Seeing that things were getting to this point, Chong took off his hood and extended his hand to the side, causing Little Nine's poisonous mist to appear. He began to stare at the man intensely and told Little Nine that it was no longer necessary to restrain himself. Hearing this, she manifested herself through the poisonous fog, and while looking at the man with a murderous look, she responded with an understanding. Seeing the poisonous mist, the man became even more aggressive. He started screaming and asking Chong if he really believed he would scare him again with the same trick. Just before Chong could give this guy a good choice, someone appeared and addressed the man like a sentai, reminding him once again that they should act discreetly when listening to the voice. Sentai's expression changed drastically. He clenched his teeth tightly, and as he slowly turned his head back, he couldn't help but feel fear. Chong just stood silently watching and began to wonder what was going on. A man with blue hair and wearing a hood appeared behind Sentai. He was quite angry. He started looking at him with a murderous look, and asked him what he was doing here when he had asked him to look for someone. Sentai was scared to the core. He clenched his teeth tightly, and as he slowly turned his head back, he began to tremble and tried to give an explanation. But just before he could speak, the man interrupted him, turned around, slightly turned his head towards him, and with a disappointing look, called him trash that only caused trouble. Upon hearing this, the poor Sentai became even more frightened, and just before he could articulate a word, the man hit him hard under the chin, causing his nose to begin to bleed. This man was part of the Sayo family. As his body emitted a powerful energy, he turned his head towards Sentai with a murderous look. Reminding him once again that he was nothing more than a Sayo family dog, that he had no right to use the Sayo family name immediately, Sentai fell to his knees on the ground, bowed his head to him, and apologized, explaining that he would not forget it in the future. Now that there was going to be no action, Jian put his hood back on, turned his head towards them and watched them in incredibly unaware of the man's presence. It wasn't long before he realized that this guy was more dangerous than the previous warrior. As Hentai stood up, the man began to approach Jian, and apologized by explaining that his dog tends to bite things. He was willing to compensate the protagonist for this. Jian simply asked him not to worry, as it was not necessary. Hearing this, the man approached him and with a smile asked him if he was going to the desert. The man approached him, and while his body emanated a powerful energy, he began to stare at him and asked him if he wanted to go to the desert together. Jian simply stared at him, and was silent for several seconds. Then he turned his back on them, and as he slowly walked away from them, he refused to go with him, as he preferred to go alone. Hearing this, the man simply watched Jian walk away and remained silent. He thought I was a pretty interesting person. He knew that Jian had awakened the divine class of creation called the Spiritual Master. Once Jian had gotten far enough away from them, Sentai stood up, approached the man and asked him if he should continue looking for the person he had been in charge of. The man turned his head slightly towards him, and while looking into his eyes, he answered that no, because by the time he finished it would be too late. Besides, he had already found the clues. The girl they were looking for had escaped the city and probably wanted to cross the desert to get to the nearest station. She removed her hood with her hand, and as she walked away from Hyatai, she asked him not to allow her to reach the inn alive, giving him the order to call all the scattered servants and come with him to the desert. Hyatai placed both hands on his chest under his head, closed his eyes and answered knowingly. Humans had spread widely across this planet and had built countless cities. However, with the arrival of the awakened age, waves of beasts, secret kingdoms and dungeons invading human homes, led to the constant remodeling of ancient human dwellings with great power. Today, only the awakened who sought power would return to these places to fight monsters, level up, and obtain riches. Now these places are known as the Wildlands. Jian began to advance through the area, and on the way he came across a lot of rats. Several hours later, Jian arrived in a remote, destroyed part of the city. As he walked, he began to feel as if he had been lost. He was heading for the leprechaun beast's nest and had already been walking for several hours. It was night and he hadn't arrived yet. The little girl was hungry, so she hunted a rat. He climbed onto Gianni's head, holding it in his mouth. He realized it didn't taste good. He decided he couldn't eat anything on the way. Jian had seen many monsters, but now that he had arrived in this area, he couldn't even spot a strong monster. These monsters granted a very low devour value if someone did not find a beast boss's nest, considering the time it would take him to return. while whoever was walking began to look forward with a serious look and got lost. At that moment the sky began to fill with dark clouds until several seconds later it began to rain. At that moment, a giant spider lurking in the area noticed Jian's presence, and as it slowly descended towards him, began to stare at him with a murderous look. Jian extended his hand to one side, and as the raindrops fell on his hand, he realized that this rain was a magical fluctuation, which meant that he had entered an area where some beast nests were located. He couldn't help but feel joy because although they had made a mistake when looking for the beast's nest, fortunately they had found it. Now the only thing left was to quickly find the monster to completely fill the devour bar for the first time. Several seconds later, Hu turned his head back and saw the monster slowly approaching him. They both began to stare at each other and remained there for several seconds. Little Nine came forward and looking intently at the monster asked Jian if he wanted me to intervene. Jian raised his head slightly, and while looking at the monster he replied that it was not necessary since the level of this monster was not high and it seemed to have a slightly larger body size than the other monsters. Taking advantage of this, the monster descended to the ground and began to prepare its sharp legs to attack him with a murderous look. The monster began to attack Jian with its sharp paws, but without much effort. He gained momentum and began to dodge attacks with small jumps. Then, taking advantage of the moment, he gathered his strength and made a great leap in the blink of an eye. He appeared on top of the monster, clenched his fist tightly, and prepared to strike the monster. He raised his head, and when he saw Jean, he was terrified, and began to wonder what was happening. Jean hit the monster hard, causing his body to hit the ground, ending his life and shattering the ground into pieces. While Jian was lost in thought, Leto appeared. The Nine put his hand to his forehead and reported that more monsters had appeared. Hearing his voice, Jian came out of his trance, turned his head to one side, and was surprised by the sound of his blow. It had caught the attention of all the other monsters hiding in the area. As Jian stood over the monster's corpse, the giant spiders began to approach him. Seeing this, he extended his hand to the side and used the poisonous mist to summon the dagger he had obtained earlier in the secret realm. While the Nine were staring at the giant spiders, he told her that it was time to enjoy a good meal. They both began to stare at the giant spiders with a murderous look, and he asked her if she was ready, to which she responded without hesitation, which she was. Hu activated Leto's poisonous mist, the line gained momentum, and in the blink of an eye attacked the spiders using its dagger, cutting their bodies into pieces and infecting them with the poisonous mist in the process. As they advanced, their levels also rose rapidly. If they kept fighting monsters on the way back, they could at least level up twice more. Within seconds, the monsters began to die. Those who had not received a mortal wound died due to the poisonous fog that began to corrode their bodies in the blink of an eye. All the monsters died in a pile of corpses. Jian approached and asked Alito, the Nine, to devour the remains of all these monsters. She got quite happy, extended her hands to her sides and thanked him. At that moment he began to look to the side and reported that something large, powerful, and delicious was approaching. Upon hearing this, he also turned his head to the side, and seeing that Little Mine was quite excited, it didn't take him long to realize that what was approaching was the boss, who turned his head in the direction from which he was approaching. The chief extended his hand and with a murderous look used the poisonous mist and gave the order to Little Mine to attack. The chief began to approach and his shadow began to become visible through the fog. Seeing this, Leto Line did not disobey the order and attacked the boss. Several seconds later he began to scream in pain when he saw that the boss had a woman's voice, who turned her head towards him and felt somewhat confused. It turns out that Leto Line had made a mistake, since the one approaching was a woman and not the boss. Due to Jian's attack, part of the woman's clothes were torn and in a matter of seconds she fell backwards to the floor unconscious. As he stood there watching her, she began to wonder what kind of magical creature that was. The woman regained consciousness. Seconds later, he opened his eyes and while looking up at the sky with a surprised expression, he began to wonder where he was and what was happening. He sat up with the help of one hand, placed the other on his head. There, as he gradually regained consciousness, he began to wonder what kind of place it was. He remembered that he had not come here as he touched his head and slowly tried to understand the situation. Jian approached her, sat down beside her, rested his elbows on his knees, closed his eyes, and with a pleasant smile asked her if she was awake. Hearing Jian's voice, she became alert and began to wonder who he was. Without wasting a second, she stood up and jumped away from him. She took an offensive stance and as she watched, Jian asked her who he was and also asked her not to come near her. He got up, turned his body towards her and with you, calm, asked her not to worry, since he was just a job changer who had come to the desert to fight monsters. He also added that he hadn't come to hurt her. Looking at him more closely, she remembered who Jian was. She put one hand to her chest, began to point at Jian with the other. As she stared at him, she told him that she knew he was the one who had attacked her before. Upon hearing this, Ian got a little nervous, closed his eyes and with a smile apologized to her, explaining that he had confused her for a monster. Seeing that Ian was quite attractive, she couldn't help but blush. She turned her head towards him and asked how anyone could say that a girl as pretty as her looked like a monster. She couldn't help calling him presumptuous, panicked. He quickly began touching his head and face to see if his nose and ears were where they should be. Jian simply stood watching her as he had used all his strength when he attacked her. Now seeing that she still had so much vitality and seemed as if nothing had happened, he began to wonder who she was and how she could resist his attack. Several seconds later, after checking that he had no injuries, he calmed down. Then he extended his hand to one side and the gold ring on his finger began to glow and emit green energy. This ring was like a kind of clock that started projecting the time. Looking at the time, he realized he had wasted too much time. She turned her back on Jian and as she walked away from him, she decided to leave quickly before they caught her. As he slowly walked away, Jian simply remained silent. He began to stare at her, began to wonder why she was walking away and who the people were chasing her. The woman moved away from him a little, but suddenly stopped abruptly, put her hand to her mouth, and began to bite her nails. Jian soon realized something was wrong. He approached the woman and seeing that she was very nervous, he asked her if there was any problem. As Tara began to hold on to herself, she turned her head slightly, closed her eyes, and forced a smile. She replied that there were some monsters ahead and since she wasn't very good at fighting, she decided to retreat and let Jian take care of the monsters in a matter of seconds. She stopped being nervous, turned her back on him again, waved goodbye and told him that was it and decided to leave. Seeing this, Jian's expression changed drastically. With a confused look he began to look at the woman and thought that her acting skills were truly a shame. At that moment it began to rain and the woman left. Jian started walking around the area and thought that if there were monsters ahead it was good, because this was exactly what he wanted, since these monsters were no opponents for him. Although they gave him devour points, there was a problem. Jian turned his head slightly to one side, and with a serious expression, he thought that dealing with other job changers was going to be difficult. The desert had always been a lawless place, where many people engaged in killing and stealing property. He began to question whether it was a good idea to capture the woman from before and ask her again. While Hu was lost in his thoughts, Little Nine appeared and began to point forward with her finger and with a serious expression informed her that many monsters were approaching that side. Far from being scared or running away, Jian was happy. He turned his head slightly towards her, and when he heard that there were many monsters he told her that it was great. His happiness did not last long. He turned his head to one side and when he saw what was in front of him, he was shocked. Hundreds of giant spiders appeared in front of him, just like the ones he had just defeated. Among them was one even larger than the rest, which began to look at him with a murderous look. While Jian's body was surrounded by powerful energy, he began to look at the spiders and thought that this was not good for him. Fighting some of them wouldn't be a problem, but now that there were so many spiders he couldn't face them. While little by little the giant spiders approached him with a serious look, he began to stare at them and thought that the woman was not lying. Despite being surrounded by monsters, he felt relieved. I'd rather fight these monsters than the job changers. The giant spiders became enraged and with a murderous look they gathered momentum and began to advance rapidly towards him. Seeing this he could no longer help but feel happy, since he had no reason not to want the devouring courage that was approaching him. Jian unsheathed the two nagas, and as his body emitted a powerful and suffocating energy, he began to stare at the monsters, giving Little Nile the order to activate the poisonous mist. She did not disobey the order and responded with an understanding. At that moment, poisonous mist began to emerge from the daggers he held in the blink of an eye. The giant spiders approached him, opened their mouths, and prepared to attack. While Jian's body was surrounded by poisonous mist he remained still for several seconds. One of the giant spiders tried to attack him, but Jian moved at incredible speed and using the vague and poisonous mist of Little Nile, he gained momentum and in the blink of an eye, he went through his body splitting him in half and infecting him with the poisonous mist in the process. While he was in the air, He turned his head back slightly, and as he stared at the monsters with a murderous look, he thought this was strange because he didn't know, because these spiders had become much faster than before. While Jian was distracted, another giant spider gained momentum and began to advance towards him at great speed. As he slowly approached, he began to look at him with a murderous look and prepared to attack. Jian soon sensed the giant spider's presence. He quickly turned his head back slightly, and seeing that he was trying to attack by surprise, he was a little surprised. But unfortunately for the giant spider, Jian wasn't going to sit idly by. Just before he could make a move in the blink of an eye, Hu cut his body into pieces using the daggers. The pieces of his body fell to the ground, and several seconds later, Hu landed on the ground while holding the two daggers with both hands, and his body was releasing the poisonous mist from Little Nine. With a murderous look, he began to look at the corpse and realized that this was not right. Although he had reacted in time to the attack and ended his life in the blink of an eye, he had received a small cut in his abdomen in the process. At that moment, the little spiders began to rapidly advance towards him, and it didn't take him long to realize that these monsters were actually cooperating with each other. Upon closer inspection, he found a spider that was very different from the rest. This spider had 6 eyes and was much larger, so he quickly concluded that this spider was the boss. Seeing this, he began to question whether this boss was ordering the others. In the blink of an eye, thousands of spiders appeared and surrounded Zhang. As his body released the little girl's poisonous mist, Nine began to stare at the boss, and instead of fleeing, he simply stood still. Jian finally understood that the thousands of monsters that lived in this area had the same strategy, both in numbers and tactics, so it was not surprising that no one came here with a serious look. Hu started staring at the boss and thought that the only way to defeat these little monsters was to kill the boss. Seeing the number of monsters present, he thought this was going to be a little difficult. While he was lost in his thoughts, little Nina emerged through the poisonous fog and put her hand on his shoulder, catching his attention as she slowly manifested herself with a serious expression on her face. She began to stare at the boss and explained to Jian that she could understand the situation. He revealed that these monsters were trying to defy their master. Hearing this, Jian was a little confused, turned his head slightly towards her and asked what she was talking about. Little Nine thought these monsters were really arrogant. He spread his hands to his sides, began to look up at the sky, opened his mouth and let out a loud roar. Hearing Little Nine's roar, the spiders finally realized that she was the insect mother, and without thinking twice, all the little spiders began to run away, seeing the spiders running away in disorder. Hu was a little surprised. And he began to wonder if the reason might be that these monsters were also insects. Little Nine approached Jian, turned her head slightly towards him, informed him that she had cut the connection between the boss and the small spiders. Gan didn't expect Little Nine's abilities to be used in this way. Now that the monsters were disoriented, it was going to be much easier for him to defeat them. He extended the two daggers to his sides, and while staring at the boss with a murderous look, he praised Little Nine for doing a good job and decided it was time to finish the boss once and for all. Hearing this, Little Nine began to return to her original form, began to stare at the boss with a murderous look, and responded with an understanding master. As Jean's body released the little girl's poisonous mist, Nine gathered momentum, took a big leap and ordered her to follow him closely in the blink of an eye using his daggers, ending the lives of several monsters by cutting their bodies into pieces. He no longer had to worry about anything, since without the boss's control, these monsters were in disorder. John began to move at great speed towards the monsters, and using his daggers, he began to cut their bodies into pieces. Now that the monsters were scattered and disorganized, they no longer posed a threat to him, so he didn't need to waste any more time. In a matter of seconds, Jian killed several monsters. Then he gathered momentum, took a great leap, and as he hurried toward the chief, he thought there was only one target left now. The chief opened his mouth and with a murderous look, he began to stare at Jian and roar. Jian decided not to back away and looked back. He prepared to attack, figuring that the chief was the one who could provide the greatest devouring value. The chief tried to defend himself, but it was in vain. Just before he could make a move, Hu descended on him and quickly attacked him in the head with both daggers, infecting him with Little Nine's poisonous mist in the process. Despite the size difference, in a matter of seconds, he lost his life and fell to the ground. Jian landed on the chief's corpse, holding both daggers in his hands. Her body began to emit Little Nine's poisonous mist. He stared at her lifeless body and decided it was time to raise the swarm of insects. He approached the chief's corpse. She stared at him. "I couldn't believe I'd finally defeated him. At that moment, a system window appeared to congratulate him on leveling up. I was now at level 14.1 power rating of 127 stars and passive skill effects and level increase continued. Sure enough, Jian clenched his fist and began to glow. She tilted her head slightly towards him and with a smile thought that as the level increased, the force also continued to increase. He had 127 stars, which meant that his individual combat power was already almost equivalent to that of a level 25 professional. In combat class he started to turn his head back and thought that now he just had to devour the corpses of the monsters and get devour points. Seeing how powerful they were and feeling the power of the mother insect, the little spiders began to flee the area. They were intelligent monsters, and they were fully aware that they had no chance of winning against them. Jian turned his head back and, seeing the little spiders fleeing, thought there was no longer any threat. It didn't take him long to realize that these spiders had understood the situation and were therefore escaping. Despite wanting to kill these monsters to earn points, he decided not to, as the most important thing now was to start creating bugs. He began to walk towards the corpses of the monsters, and little by little Little Nine began to manifest through the poisonous fog with a murderous look, who began to stare at the boss's corpse, clenched his fist tightly, extended the other towards the sky and told Little Nine that it now belonged to her. Upon hearing this, she thanked him and then returned to her natural form. Then he opened his mouth, jumped, and began to move toward the chief's corpse. He started devouring the corpse and a system window popped up to grant him 600 devour points. While Little Nine was enjoying her food, Jian turned his body to one side, and with a serious look, he thought that elite monsters like this boss were different from the others, as they could provide high devouring value. It didn't take long for him to come to the conclusion that quickly hunting and breeding the insect swarm was a good way to become stronger and hunt more elite monsters. Several seconds later, another system window appeared in front of him to inform him that the devour value was complete. The system asked him if he wanted to start breeding insects. Who began to look at the system window and seeing how quickly it had filled up, the devour value was amazed. He soon realized that Light's monsters gave a lot more points than regular monsters. Several seconds later, Little Nine returned to her human form, knelt before him, placing one hand on her knee and the other on the ground. Then she bowed her head to him and reported that Little Nine was now ready to reproduce. He asked her to allow him to continue following him with a much stronger power. As Jian's body emanated, a powerful aura turned his head to one side and remained silent for several seconds. Lost in his thoughts, he slightly turned his head towards her and with a smile decided that it was time to start raising the insects. At that moment, a system window appeared to inform him that Little Nine had already started the first generation of mass insect breeding. Jian's body and Little Nine's body began to emit a wave of energy and the system informed him that the accelerated growth of talents and the blessing of the growth of all things were, in fact, with a serious look, Jian began to stare at Little Nine and thought to himself that his passive abilities were more effective in accelerating insect breeding. Several seconds later, Little Nine's mark appeared on his hand. Seeing this, he soon realized it was a new skill. His guess was correct, as a system window popped up to grant him two new exclusive abilities called Bug Nest and Dominion. Then another system window popped up to inform him that the bug breeding had been sped up and there were 8 seconds left. Seeing this, Jian thought the insect breeding was almost complete. Jian raised his head to the sky and when he saw what was in front of him he was surprised. He couldn't help but wonder if it was a colony of insects. In front of him was Little Nine, with both hands extended to her sides and reproducing in the blink of an eye. Thousands of insects appeared and began to fly around him. The system congratulated Jian on successfully completing the breeding of the first swarm of insects. According to the system, there were a total of 2,300 insects. Jian turned his head to one side and as he looked at the insects, he began to smile and thought that the number was really impressive. I couldn't believe that the first breeding cycle of insects could reach over 2,000 young. This was only the first generation, I didn't know what would happen. In the third or fourth generation one of the insects, he approached Jian sensing his presence, turned his body towards him, and began to caress his head. She really liked these bugs, however, her abilities and Little Nine's were different. I noticed that the bugs had also picked up some new abilities. The insect's status window appeared, it was called Son of Nine Wings of Miasma, it had 4 abilities. The first was Poisonous Mist that allowed it to corrode and devour everything it touched, the second was Camouflage. This ability allowed him to camouflage himself using the reflection of his wings. The third was Frenzy. When using this ability, the devour value was continuously consumed in exchange for temporarily increasing strength and speed. The fourth and final ability was called self-destruction. This ability allowed him to explode his body, releasing toxins and causing massive damage in the process. Jian thought the camouflage and self-destruct abilities seemed quite useful. While he was lost in his thoughts, Little Nine approached him from behind and hugged him. He closed his eyes and with a smile caught his attention. Hearing her voice, Jian came out of his trance, turned his head slightly towards her and couldn't help but smile and feel calm. He turned his body towards her, began to caress her head and with a smile thought that she seemed to have changed, but not much. Little Nine closed her eyes, placed her hands on her chest and with a happy smile informed him that she had finished the insect breeding process. Then she took Jian's arm with both hands and told him she wanted to rest. On hearing this, she asked him what he meant by rest. At that moment his body began to disappear. Jian turned his head slightly toward his hand and at this he felt somewhat confused. He began to wonder where she had gone, and at that moment a system window appeared to inform him that Little Nine had returned to the bug nest. Jian began to look at his hand and couldn't help but smile and feel relieved. The space of the system was incredible. It was a space that could accommodate swarms of insects. It didn't matter how many swarms there were now. Everyone could hide inside the system, so Jian would no longer fear being discovered by anyone. The bug nest was a new skill he'd acquired. It was an ability that was granted at the highest level, which meant that you couldn't level up. Chan activated Little Nine's mark, began to look at her hand and saw that she was sleeping peacefully. He realized that after reproduction, insects needed sleep. Chan remembered that he had just acquired a new ability called Dominion, so he decided to try it out and see how it worked. He extended his hand to the side and activated the ability. As he did this, his body began to emit a powerful and suffocating energy, and his eyes began to shine. Once Jian activated the ability, the insects next to him turned their heads towards him and began to look at him. With a murderous look, Jian turned his head towards them and with a murderous look he realized how this ability worked, extended his hand towards the sky and began to absorb the insects. This new ability allowed Jian to control the swarm of insects. He turned his head towards his hand, thinking that using this ability was as easy as moving an arm. As Jian's eyes sparkled, he began to look ahead and was amazed to use this ability. He could also use insects' senses. Now Jian could perceive the world the way insects did. Looking around, he saw that this place was full of monsters hidden and ready to stalk their prey. Jian turned his head to one side, and, seeing the insects' behavior, couldn't help but smile. He realized they were excited too. With a murderous look, Jian and the insects began to stare at the monsters while his body was surrounded by poisonous mist. Little Nine gave them the order to attack, as it was time to test their new skills. Upon hearing his command, thousands of insects destroyed a nearby building to pieces to attract the attention of all the monsters in the area. His plan worked, as all the monsters near the area turned their heads to where they were and began to slowly approach to see what was happening. Jian decided not to wait any longer and go after the monsters as his body released. Little Nine's poisonous mist began to approach the monsters, who soon realized what was about to happen. They tried to escape, but it was too late, just before they could move. The poisonous mist began to swiftly approach them. In a matter of seconds the poisonous mist adhered to the monsters and slowly began to corrode their bodies, causing them immense pain. Soon after, all the monsters that had been affected by it lost their lives and fell to the ground. Now that they were dead, the poisonous fog slowly began to devour them, who approached the corpses and began to stare at them with the swarm of insects. There was almost no need for him to take action. Now the range of the poisonous mist was much greater, devouring its targets faster and more extensively. Also, he now had shared vision with the ability called Domination. Common monsters could no longer hide from the swarm of insects. Who turned his head to one side and while watching how Little Nine's poisonous mist slowly devoured the monster corpses, he began to smile and thought that he could soon create more insects. He remembered that he hadn't looked carefully at how much devouring value was needed for the next insect brood. Thinking about this, he opened the system window and saw what had appeared on the system interface. Who was surprised and started to wonder what was going on and what was this? A few meters away, in an old abandoned warehouse, a man arrived panting and hurriedly informed his boss that this guy had returned with a hood and green hair. He could not hide his fear when his leader, a tall man with braids, saw him, demanded to know why it had taken so long and ordered him to quickly report what was happening in the spider's nest. The man, his green hair still trembling, told him that the spider's nest had been completely annihilated by someone mysterious and unknown. Not a single monster was left alive. The leader, incredulous, turned to him and with a look of astonishment asked him if that was a joke. The idea that anyone had destroyed the entire nest was inconceivable. Another nearby man approached Noir. This too surprised, the one with the green hair with a serious expression, confirmed the story and added that the city of monsters was in ruins. The leader, touching his chin and looking at the ground, could not believe what he was hearing. It was too scary to be true. At first he wondered if the culprit might be a member of the Night's Watch, but he soon dismissed that idea. It wasn't his style. He came to the conclusion that it must be a covert operation of a hidden family or a powerful assault group. He decided that it was best to retire for them. This was a shame, since their mission was to fill a bottle with wolf spider venom. They failed, so the leader resolved to make up for the losses by stealing some unlucky ones on the way back. The man next to the leader, upon hearing this, began to sweat and get nervous. While they were talking, someone opened the warehouse door. The three turned around and the green-haired man announced that they had an unexpected visitor. Someone put a hand on the door and when he opened it, he slowly declared that he had finally found other professionals. The curious leader asked who this guy was. Jung. He walked confidently into the warehouse, held out a hand and told them not to worry, that he was only there to level up and that he wanted to trade some food with them. Hearing this, the leader was relieved to see that Jung came alone with a smile. He agreed to trade food, though he remembered that food wasn't cheap in the desert. He asked Jung that he wanted to change the expression of the man next to the leader. He changed drastically by adopting a defensive stance and staring at Jung, who approached the leader with a calm smile and told him not to worry, that he had very good items to exchange the man. Hearing this, his expression changed again. Now, feeling curious and smiling, intrigued by what Junk had to offer, the leader ordered Junk to show him the objects he had. At that moment, the two men surrounded Junk with a smile and began to draw their swords. Junk turned his head slightly toward them and couldn't help smiling. From the beginning he knew he couldn't trust them, so without thinking twice, he activated the ring and extended his hand towards them. In the blink of an eye, several spiders emerged from the ring, and with penetrating eyes began to observe the men. Jung turned his back on them. There, in a mocking voice, he asked if his products seemed good to them. Seeing the spiders, the men sheathed their swords again, took a few steps back, and were on high alert. They began to sweat and feel afraid, aware that these were werewolf spiders. They wondered if they had not been annihilated along with the spider nest, and began to suspect that Junk might be the one who had killed all the spiders. Junk Chen's current level was 17. He slightly turned his head towards them, gave them an overwhelming look, and with a smile told them not to think, that they didn't know what they wanted to do. After saying this, Junk sat down on a rock, turned his head slightly towards them, and calmly revealed that he was very angry, so he advised them to grab their weapons and leave immediately. Upon hearing this, the three men took their belongings, turned their backs on Jung, started running and apologized for bothering him, adding that they would leave immediately. Several minutes later, once the men had fled the warehouse, Jung extended his hand to one side, releasing the poisonous mist. Crime 9 gave the order for the insects to come out while John sat on the rock with one arm resting on his knee, raised his hand and used the poisonous mist to release 2 insects. These began to fly around him with a murderous look, looking for any hidden threat. Junk began to drink some of the soup the men had left behind. He was getting hungrier, and he thought he should have known better. When he got Stone 9, he didn't expect leading the insect swarm to have so many side effects. As he drank the soup, a system window appeared and Jung's devouring value increased. I now had 2768 points out of 1,000. The system advised him to increase the value as soon as possible. He originally thought that the devour value would increase faster after the insect swarm doubled, but he didn't expect the devour value of the next spawning to double as well. This made things very complicated for Jung, since now the devouring courage that a boss could provide was only a drop in the ocean. Even if I eliminated all the beast nests outside the city, it wouldn't be enough to fill the devour value for the next breeding. Jung began to stare at the ground and sank into his thoughts. He had heard that the beast nests and secret kingdoms controlled by the Night's Watch were not going to be made public, which meant that if he wanted to increase the devour value of his swarm, he would have to join the Night's Watch as soon as possible. He began to look at his hand and saw that the milestone 9 had not yet woken up. Seeing this, he quickly concluded that the playback load was not small. At that moment, Jung began to feel the presence of someone. Immediately his expression changed drastically as he turned his head to one side and wondered what that person was doing. There he stood up, clenched his fist tightly, turned his head slightly to one side, and assumed an offensive posture. I could smell the aroma of the there, and since there were a lot of people chasing her, I didn't know what was happening to Ginny because they were chasing her. Several seconds later, a girl who was using an invisibility spell entered the warehouse, collided with John and fell to the ground. She was the same girl as before. She leaned with one hand on the floor and began to touch her head with the other because it hurt. John turned his head towards her and with a confused look, he began to wonder why he had met her again. While the girl lay on the ground, she placed one hand on the floor, the other on her chest, raised her head towards Yoon and recognized him, unexpectedly, as the boy from the spider's nest. She began to look at him with a frightened look and asked him not to tell anyone that he had seen her there. Hearing this, John couldn't help but be surprised, turned his head towards her and couldn't help but look at her with an expression of amazement. She'd been so close to him that she hadn't even been able to feel his presence. It didn't take her long to conclude that the person the blue-haired man was chasing was her. He decided to take the girl to a safe place, but at that moment he felt the presence of someone else. He quickly turned his head towards the entrance of the warehouse and with a serious look he thought it was too late to leave. Several seconds later, several people entered the warehouse. Among them were Hank, Tae, and the blue-haired man who was part of the SEO family. They started walking toward Young, and Hank Tae soon recognized him. He couldn't help feeling fear and chills. He pointed his finger at Young and informed his leader that he was the same guy they had encountered before. The blue-haired man reached into his pants pocket. He began to look at Yoon with a smile, congratulated his subordinate on having a good sense of smell. Young sat down on the rock again, rested his hands on his knees, and remained silent. Upon closer inspection, the man realized that the place was empty, and that Young was camping alone. With a look full of Ida, Hangta began to look at Junk and asked him if a girl had entered the warehouse. A moment ago she ordered him to respond immediately, or else I would kill him this time. The blue-haired man began to look at Junk, put his hand in front of Hangta, and with a smile asked him to wait. He approached Young, sat down on the rock opposite him, and began to talk to him. He knew that Young belonged to the spiritual master class and had noticed that he had risen in level very quickly. It had been less than a day since they last saw each other and Junk was already at level 16. The man became more and more interested in Junk, decided to put this topic aside and explained that he now had something urgent to do. As he sat on the rock, Junk remained silent. The man sat back, one arm on his knee, took out his sword, pointed it at Juni's neck with a serious look, asked her if she had seen a black-haired girl there. His subordinates approached, stood behind him, and remained silent. Jung just kept his cool. He began to look into the man's eyes and quickly concluded that based on the aura emanating from his body, his level was very high, exceeding level 30. Seeing that he could accurately detect his class and level, he thought that this man must have some detection equipment. With it, Jung turned his head to one side, began to point towards the back door of the warehouse and explained to the man that he had just seen a shadow going in that direction. He also added that since he did not belong to the perceptive class, he was not sure if he was the person they were looking for. Hearing this, the man began to get up and decided to believe him tentatively. He also advised Jung to be more honest. Jung turned his head in surprise. The man stood up, turned his back to Jung, turned his head slightly towards him and with a murderous look warned him that if he found out that he had helped that girl, the Su family would not let him go. Hearing this, Hankstein also slightly turned his head towards him and couldn't help but smile. Several seconds later, the man and his subordinates began to leave the warehouse. Jung turned his body towards them, and as he watched them gradually move away, he remembered that the Seo family was the most powerful in Xiango. With a penetrating gaze, he began to observe the blue-haired man and thought that the clans in the city had a long history and all of them were feudal officials. They were also extremely mysterious and rarely involved in the world. Unless there was a big disaster. Some powerful men in the family could even divide heaven and earth. This guy was more powerful than Junk had thought for him. It wasn't good to be remembered by someone like that. Several seconds later, Junk turned his head slightly toward the warehouse exit and saw that the man was already gone. He decided to leave too, since it was not good for him to stay in that place. The girl came out of her hiding place, approached Jung, put her hands on his hips and thanked him for saving her. Jung stood up, turned his body toward her, and remained silent. He quickly grabbed her arm, and seeing this, the girl got scared and began to wonder what she planned to do. Jung approached her, began to look her in the eyes with an aggressive look and told her that he was almost cheating on him like last time, since he had helped her again. He asked her how she had gotten into trouble with these people. Jung was so close to her that he couldn't help blushing. She started looking at him and explained that her family was in huge debt. The guy was planning to take away the things they were escorting and kill them all. But I didn't expect her to escape. He was afraid the news would leak out, so he chased her. After explaining this, she asked Jung if he wanted to silence her. Hearing this, Jung let go of his hand, turned his back on him, and began to walk away. Seeing him, she put one hand on his chest, extended the other towards him, and told him that she would always remember that he had helped her, and that she would be very grateful to him in the future. As he walked away from the girl, Jung closed his eyes, clenched his fists tightly, and told her he didn't want to get involved in her affairs. At that moment, Jung stopped abruptly, opened his eyes and felt that something was wrong. The girl noticed it too, and her expression changed drastically. With a fearful look, he revealed that someone had placed a barrier spell around the warehouse. Just then, someone outside the warehouse gave the order to his subordinates to leave. Jung began to look towards the warehouse entrance and realized that it was now impossible to escape. He knew that even if the girl said she didn't know him, they wouldn't believe her. He activated his insect perception, and began to walk through the area, realizing that they were surrounded on all sides. With a serious look, Jung prepared himself to face any opponent on the other side. The girl got scared and put her hand to her chest. Several seconds later, the blue-haired man and his subordinates appeared, emitting a murderous aura with a piercing gaze. They began to look at Jung, ready to finish him off. They knew Jung had lied to them. The blue-haired man approached him, looked him in the eye and ordered him to hand over the girl, calling him a bastard and accusing him of lying to him. He ordered his subordinates to capture the girl with a serious look. Jung just stared at them in silence. Seeing the blue-haired man, the girl's expression changed drastically. She began to look at him in panic and terror, explaining to Jung that he had already taken everything the family later owned. Then he asked the man why he wanted to kill her so desperately. The man looked at her and asked her calmly if she really needed a reason. Hearing that she belonged to the Low family, John turned his head towards her and began to observe her intensely with a serious look. John and the girl were on the second floor of the abandoned warehouse, while the blue-haired man and his subordinates were on the first floor. The girl clenched her fist with one hand, extended the other to one side, looked at the man and told him that if he killed her, the Low family would never forgive him and they would not let him live in peace. Jung, who was standing behind her, simply dropped his arms to his sides and continued watching the man. Hearing this, the blue-haired man couldn't help but explode. Laughing, he asked the girl if he really believed that a family like the Low was capable of doing that. At that moment, his subordinates began to look at the girl and couldn't help but smile. With one hand on his waist, the man lowered his head. He put the other hand on his face and couldn't help but laugh at the idea that a second-rate family with a little money would really take themselves seriously. He revealed to the girl that without the protection of the ancestors of the Sea family or 100 years ago, the Low family would have been annihilated, a long time ago. Hearing this, one of his subordinates drew his sword and the others began to laugh. Huntai crossed his arms, stared at Junie, couldn't help but smile. After saying this, the man removed his hand from his face, raised his head, and with a serious look told the girl that in the eyes of the Su family, they were no different from humble peasants. He also added that to him they were only cattle that the Su family could slaughter. Hearing this, Jun turned his head towards him, and with a look full of hatred, began to observe him intensely. I couldn't believe someone could be so arrogant. The man extended his hand forward and his palm began to emit a powerful red energy that rose towards the sky. Then he looked at the girl and with a smile asked her what the S family could investigate or if there was nothing to find. Several seconds later, the energy he had released began to create a powerful barrier around the abandoned warehouse. This ability is called the SE Family Dragon Prison Formation. The girl looked up at the sky, put a hand on her chest, clenched her fist, and couldn't help but be amazed and panic, as she now didn't know how she was going to escape from there. John raised his head and when he saw the barrier he couldn't help but be amazed. To him, the blue-haired man was very interesting. While Ion and the girl were on the second floor of the abandoned warehouse, Hank Tae drew his sword, began to look at the girl, and prepared to attack. He asked the others to listen, dazedly, to the young master, and leave no one alive. The others responded knowingly, The blue-haired man next to Hank Tae simply remained silent. Several seconds later, Hank Tae prepared to attack, but at that moment the blue-haired man stood in front of him and raised his hand to signal him to stop. Then he began to look at Jung and with a smile told him that the girl in the family should not die. Today he was still interested in Jung, since he knew very well that he possessed the divine rank creation class. After saying this, while still looking at Jung, he explained to Hank Tae that the creation class, called spiritual master, was a very strange profession, not like other people who didn't know what it was. Then he extended his hand to the side and with a smile decided to give him there a chance to get everything under heaven. Today he extended his hand and gave him the order to capture the girl in exchange for sparing her life so she could serve the family. Co hearing this. The girl with her hands on her waist couldn't help but be shocked. John, on the other hand, dropped his arms to his sides and remained silent for several seconds. He began to look towards the ground, and couldn't help but smile and praise the man, as the SEO family bastards were really good at making proposals. The girl turned her head towards him, and when she saw him she couldn't help but panic, wondering if John was really going to accept her proposal. With a murderous look, Samk looked at the blue-haired man and rejected his offer, mocking him by telling him that the Saoyi family could go to hell. After saying this, he clenched his fist tightly, and while his body released the poisonous mist of little 9.1 with a serious look, he told him that he refused. He also asked if she could stand up to him, if he was looking for a fight. The girl turned her body towards San, brought her hands close to her chest and seeing that her body was surrounded by the poisonous mist, she couldn't help but take a few steps back and feel terrified. He began to wonder what was going on. Upon hearing Salga he had rejected his proposal. The blue-haired man couldn't help but get angry, as this was a disgrace to him. He ordered his subordinates to finish him off. On hearing the order they drew their scabbards, their swords gained momentum, they made a great leap and began to advance rapidly towards Sam while they were in the air. Hank Tae began to look at him and asked the others to be careful, as Sank was not easy to beat. As they slowly approached, Sank simply stood watching them without making any movement. Several seconds later they approached the second floor and Hank Tae, seeing that Sank's body was surrounded by poisonous mist, revealed to the others that he could use poison and advised them not to attack directly. Seeing that they were ready to attack, the girl hid behind Sank. At that moment, Sank deactivated the poisonous mist, extended his hand towards them, and while his body was surrounded by a green energy, he began to look at Hank Tae with a serious look and revealed to him that not only could he use poison, but also the ability of his talent. Seeing this, the girl took several steps back, put a hand on her chest, turned her head towards Sank and couldn't help but feel a little confused, since she didn't know what this power was. In the blink of an eye, several green spiritual roots began to emerge. Hanta approached San, grabbed the sword in both hands, and prepared to attack. But at that moment he looked towards the ground and when he saw the spiritual roots he was surprised and couldn't help but wonder what stability was. The spiritual roots grew enormously and in an instant they tangled around Hank Tae's bodies and the others, leaving them motionless, panicked as they did not know what was happening. Sam, who had his hand extended toward them, revealed that his ability was the evolution of all things. Little by little, the spiritual roots began to tighten around Hank Tae's body. He quickly grabbed the roots with his hands and started looking at Sam, unable to help but wonder what was going on. Seeing how strong the roots were, he realized that his class was of divine rank. He was also confused because he remembered that Sam could use poison too. He decided not to stand idly by, drew his sword, held it in both hands and used all his strength to cut the roots around his body into pieces. Seeing this, the others also began to do the same as he advised them to attack the roots, since they were very fragile. The spiritual roots began to fall to the ground near the blue-haired man, who began to push them away with his hands. It didn't take him long to realize what was happening. With a surprised look, he screamed and called Hank Tae, "Idiot," explaining that this was just a distraction. He also added that Sank was ready to attack. Sank took advantage of Hank, Tae, and the others being distracted to release the insects who began to look at them with penetrating eyes. While his body was surrounded by the poisonous mist, he extended his hand to one side, looked at them intensely, and explained that it was already too late. The girl sat on the floor, rested her hand on it, raised her head and when she saw the insects, she was surprised. While Hank Tae's men were busy cutting the roots, the insects began to approach them. He turned his head to one side, and when he saw the insects, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't help sweating and wondering what those things were. The insects began to move at great speed and began to attack them. Hank Tae blocked the attack with his sword, but unfortunately for him, the insects were so strong that in a matter of seconds they destroyed his sword. Seeing this, he was surprised, unable to believe that San had actually destroyed his weapon. Upon closer inspection, he realized that it wasn't poisonous mist at all, but rather summoned monsters. At that moment, an insect began to approach him from behind and prepared to attack. He raised his head and saw this and was surprised. He began to scream and revealed to the others that this poisonous mist actually came from the monsters. He decided he couldn't dodge the attack. San, who had his hand extended towards him and was controlling the insect, started to look at him with a murderous look and couldn't help but smile as he had finally caught him just before the insect could attack Hank Tae. Someone approached him and put his foot on his shoulder, called him trash and told him to leave. He turned his head to one side, and when he saw this he was a little confused. Seeing this, Sans was also confused and astonished. At the same time, this person was none other than the man with blue hair. He drew his sword, grabbed it with one hand, gained momentum, took a big leap, and as he slowly advanced towards San, he used the first of Kanon's 9 forms. As he did this, his body began to emit an orange aura. While the blood body was surrounded by Little Nine's poisonous mist, he simply remained silent. The girl who was sitting on the floor next to him put her hand in front of his mouth and was terrified. Sans raised his head towards him, and seeing that he was faster than the poisonous mist, he couldn't help but grind his teeth and sweat. He used the secret soul family technique called Dragon Chase. At that moment, a dragon made of spiritual energy manifested itself and began to look at Sam, gritted its teeth and attacked him. His attack was so powerful that it destroyed the area where San was to pieces and created a smoke screen in the process. While holding the sword in one hand and holding it out towards Sam, she began to stare at him, and with a smile called him a bastard. I knew he'd be hard to deal with. But luckily his level wasn't very high and his speed wasn't fast enough. He thought that using only this sword he would be able to defeat him, but to his surprise, several seconds later, once the smoke cleared, his expression changed drastically. He was in shock, as he couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Fortunately, Zanga was still alive thanks to the girl who had used her hidden profession ability called Earth Eternal Shield, and created a shield around her. As he held his hands out toward the shield, it began to crack. She closed her eyes and, as blood flowed from her mouth, explained to Sans that she was suffering a lot. Sans, who was standing behind her, began to look at her with an expression. Surprised and stunned, she realized that she was actually the defensive type. The blue-haired man had forgotten, but now, seeing that he had blocked his attack using his shield, he couldn't help it. Rage began to look at her aggressively, clenched his teeth tightly and prepared to attack again. Qian began to look at the blue-haired man and thought it was a good opportunity to attack. He extended his hand to one side, releasing the poisonous mists. Several seconds later he landed on the ground. At that moment, several insects began to approach quickly from behind. One of his subordinates, who was lying on the ground, extended his hand towards him and caught his attention to ask him to be careful while holding the sword with one hand. He turned his head back, and when he saw the insects approaching quickly, he became alert. At that moment he grabbed one of his subordinates by the hood. Seeing this, the subordinate was confused, as he did not know what was happening. With one hand holding his sword and the other grasping his subordinate by the hood, he placed it in front of him to use as a shield. Since the insects were not very intelligent, they attacked their subordinate instead of him. The attack of the insects was so powerful that their bodies were thrown backwards. His subordinate was seriously injured, as her body lay beside him. He put one knee on the ground, put his sword on the ground, rested his arm on the other knee, and began to look down and cough. Whoever comes down from the second floor started to approach him and couldn't help but think he was a nasty bastard for using one of his own men to block the attack. The attack of the insects pierced the chest of the man who was lying on the ground. Despite being seriously injured and bleeding from the mouth, he was still alive, began to cough and caught the attention of his teacher. He got up, began to approach Juan, turned his head slightly towards his subordinate, and thanked him for enduring the attack for him. She thought that she had not educated him in vain, and seeing that he was still alive, she could not help praising him and thinking that he was truly strong. Juan, who was standing in front of him, simply remained silent. He took a Dragon John pill from his pocket with his hand, opened his mouth, and ate it. He couldn't believe he was forced to use Dragon John's pill. In a matter of seconds, his subordinate lost his life. He began to approach Dian, dragging his sword across the ground, causing small rocks to slowly begin to float. Seeing this, Dian assumed an offensive posture, while on the other side the girl sitting next to him and covering the wound on her arm with her hand, remained motionless. The blue-haired man gripped his sword tightly, pointing it at Jian, and with a murderous look he realized that his next attack would cut his head to pieces. Jian simply remained calm, looking at the man ready to face any attack. Once the dragon Joan pill and its effect, the elemental energy dragon grew enormously and appeared behind him, his eyes began to shine. Indicating that he was ready to attack, he assumed an offensive stance, stomped hard, the ground breaking into pieces. Then he gripped his sword tightly and glared at Jian, determined this time to finish him off. Its energy was so strong that the rocks around it began to float. Jian began to stare at the dragon and couldn't help but feel terror. He didn't know if he would be able to withstand the attack. The blue-haired man began to draw his sword and prepared to attack. This time he decided to use technique number 2 of Cosmin's 9 styles. At that moment he used the ability called Court of the Descending Dragon and launched a powerful attack towards Jian. As he did so, his body began to emit powerful energy, and in the blink of an eye, the elemental energy dragon began to quickly advance towards him, opened his mouth and prepared to finish him off. At that moment, the girl stood in front of Jian, extended her hands towards the attack and with a determined look, used the eternal shield of the earth. Once again, Jian put his elbow in front of her face, turned his head toward her, and seeing that, despite being wounded, she was willing to block another attack, he couldn't help but be surprised. In an instant, a green shield appeared around him. Seeing this, the spirit dragon began to break some of the ground and create a smoke curtain in the process. With his hands extended toward the shield and blocking the attack, he closed his eyes, gritted his teeth, and explained to Huangke. Because the man had taken the Syaofa family dragon John's secret pill, now the dragon's strength had multiplied several times. Now their shield wouldn't be able to withstand the attack at all, which meant they were doomed in seconds. Slowly, the shield began to crack. Seeing this, he decided to use his last flash of force to hold out as long as possible. Jean grabbed his cloak with his finger, began to look at the spirit dragon, and couldn't help but be amazed and think that the blue-haired man was really strong, as every blow of the dragon was a lethal move. The previous attack had already been amazing, so he didn't expect it to unleash such power. The blue-haired man jumped up, walked over to them, and began to stare at Jen as the shield began to crack. He couldn't help smiling. He used the descending dragon's cut several times, throwing powerful slashes at the shield. Jian looked back and extended his hand skyward, activating the mark of the insect swarm. Seeing that he was a ruthless and powerful person, he decided to show no mercy. Several seconds later, once the girl's shield broke, several thousand insects began to emerge from Jian's hand and appeared in the sky. The man, with blue hair, looked up and seeing so many insects he couldn't help but be surprised. He gritted his teeth tightly and began to wonder what was going on. As thousands of insects came out of Jian's hand, he began to look at the blue-haired man and asked him to get ready. The girl who was sitting on the floor behind him put a hand on his shoulder where he had the wound. He began to look at Jian with a surprised expression and began to wonder if he really belonged to the creation class. Several insects appeared around Jian and began to look at the blue-haired man ready to attack. Jian began to approach him and gave the order for the insects to attack. Hearing this, he clenched his teeth tightly, and couldn't help but panic. He knew that if so many insects attacked him at once, he would have no chance of winning. Hearing Jian's command, the insects began to advance towards Cao Yuanbu and prepared to attack. Seeing the number of insects, Zhongbu drew her sword and took a defensive stance. With a serious look on his face, he began to stare at Jian and used the descending dragon's cut. As he did so, his sword emitted a powerful energy. He was not willing to give up, for they were just mere insects. With little effort, he began to cut the insects into pieces, while Jia's body released the poisonous mist of Lidoline. With a piercing look, he extended his hand towards him and asked if he really believed this would work. The bodies of the injured insects began to regenerate as they saw that insects could regenerate. Joan Vaughn couldn't help but wonder how this was possible. Several seconds later, the insects began to advance toward him and attacked again. He began to defend himself from the attack with his sword, cutting the bodies of several insects in half, which quickly began to regenerate again. Seeing this, he couldn't help but panic, as he couldn't believe he really couldn't kill them. As the insects emerged from Jean's body with a serious look, he began to stare at him and decided to see how long the girl behind him could hold out. He turned his head to Joan Bai with an expression of surprise. He couldn't help but wonder how powerful he was. Hearing Jean's mockery, Joan became enraged, wielded his sword forcefully, and once again used the descending dragon slash ability, slicing the body of an insect in front of him. In 2. The spirit dragon manifested itself again, opened its mouth and began to devour the insects. He used this attack because the dragon could continue to devour the insects without allowing them to regenerate. As he lowered guard one of the bugs, he approached him from behind and gave him a hard bite on the arm, poisoning him and causing him to drop his sword in the process. When he felt the bite, he turned his head to the side, and when he saw the insect, he clenched his teeth tightly and thought this was not good at all. Now that his right hand was poisoned, he had no choice but to use the sword, so he reached into his clothes and pulled out a red object. The insects took advantage of this opportunity and began to quickly approach him, but Joan Bus took the object out of her clothes, lifted it towards the sky and used the technique called Life Jade Protection. At that moment, a powerful red energy began to appear around his body. He mocked Joan, asking if he thought he could kill the great Xuanbu with a few insignificant insects. Joan just stood there, watching him silently, without saying a word, extended his hand towards Yohanbu. He began to stare at him with a serious look and asked him what kind of treasure that was and how it had so much power. After saying this, he ordered the insects to devour him. The object had created a shield around Yohanbu's body. The insects followed Jian's command and began to attack the shield, but no matter how hard they tried, it was in vain. Seeing this, Jian quickly realized that the attack hadn't even scratched the shield. While Xuanbu covered the insect bite wound on his arm, with his hand he turned his head towards Jian and advised him not to waste his energy, since it was the treasure inherited from the Sol family, called the Jade Treasure, which had divine powers. Jian refused to give up and ordered the insects to attack again. Yohanbu stared at him and explained that, once the Jade Treasure was activated, the shield could block all external attacks. With this shield, Jian could no longer hurt him. Jian simply remained silent. As the insects continued to attack the shield, Yohanbu began to approach them as he saw that he could control the insects and bring him to the point of using the ancestral treasure. She couldn't help but praise him for being amazing. He also added that even if Sijian used all his cards, he couldn't hurt him. Seeing the man approaching, the girl stood up and grabbed Jian by his clothes. In a matter of seconds, Joan Bu began to bleed from her mouth and approached Jian with a smile. He decided to make him one last offer as long as Jian was willing to follow him and obeying him could allow him to join the Sao family and give him the Sao surname, something many dreamed of. After saying this, he asked Jian to think carefully and not miss this opportunity. Jian began to look at him with a calm look and remained in thought for several seconds. He began to stare at Joan Bai. He couldn't help but get angry when he saw that he had gotten used to being arrogant, to the point that he couldn't even see the situation he was in. Hearing this, the girl turned her head towards Eli. With a confused look, he began to wonder what Jian Zhonbush was planning. He approached Jian, held out his hand to one side, and with a smile asked him to stop boasting. He didn't care if Jian accepted or not, because even if he couldn't kill him, today he could do it any other day. With the influence of the Sao family throughout the country, he couldn't hide or face them. Jian began to stare at Joan Bai with a smile. She reminded him of his own words that you couldn't investigate if you had nothing to find. After saying this, he asked her what might happen if she died without leaving a trace. At that moment, a giant tentacle struck the ground. Hearing this sound, Joan Bu slightly turned her head back and with a look full of terror she began to wonder what was happening. This tentacle belonged to the mother of the insects, emerged from the swarm of insects and appeared behind them. Seeing how huge the girl was, Joan Bu fell to the ground looking up. There, seeing how huge and terrifying it was, she began to sweat. At that moment, Jian gave him the order to devour him. Upon hearing his command, Little Lion began to approach Joan Vu and thank Jian, since he was very hungry. Hearing this, Joan Vu's expression changed drastically. He began to feel a fear he had never felt before in his life. Little Mine began to smile and used her tentacles to attack Joan Vu's shield. Due to her enormous strength, Joan Vu's body was thrown and crashed into the wall, breaking her into pieces. He began to scream in agony, unable to believe that a monster like Little Lion really existed. He asked Jian what kind of monster she was. With a calm look, Jian explained that Little Mine had just finished breeding, so he and the jade were exactly what he needed to satisfy his hunger. Little Mine began repeatedly hitting Joan for her tentacle, creating a large smoke screen in the process. Within seconds, the shield began to shatter. Joan Do opened her mouth and began to scream in pain, questioning why the shield had broken so easily. He began to bleed from his mouth and fell to the ground. I couldn't believe what was happening now. The fate of the Saw family and the jade would disappear. With the shield already shattered, Little Nine approached him with a determined look. With a cold expression, Jian watched in silence. Little Nini attacked Huanbu, shattering the ground in the process. The attack was so powerful that all that was left of Huanbu was a pool of blood. Jian thought no one should know about this now that Huanbu was dead. He began to walk, extended his hand toward the sky, activating the swarm mark, and ordered Little Line to transform a few seconds later. Little Line transformed, returned to her human form, and embraced him. Then he closed his eyes, and with a smile said that Joan was delicious, thanked him, and added that she was the one who loved him the most. The girl who was sitting on the floor turned her head when she saw Little Line and couldn't help but feel confused and scared. He's already turned his back on her. He began to walk away and decided to take a look at the Sao family. At that moment he turned his head towards her and decided to take care of her. The girl panicked, and couldn't help sweating. She remembered that she knew her secret now, and thinking about this, she wondered if he was going to kill her to keep her quiet. Hu fixed his serious gaze on the girl and wondered what to do with her. Suddenly, his body began to emit a poisonous mist and several insects appeared behind him. Ready to attack, he approached her, looked at the ground and asked her for a good reason not to kill her. She knelt in terror. He quickly took out some gold coins, lowered his head and explained that that was all he had. They were millions, practically her entire life, and she was willing to give them to be forgiven. Jian took a gold coin, looked at the girl and thought she seemed sincere, but since he knew too much and was also lying, he decided that it was best to eliminate her. She stood up, closed her eyes, raised a hand to the sky and swore by his name. He told Sandow that if she lied to him, the heavens could punish her with 5 thunders. Jian was confused. He didn't know whether to believe him, since he always lied without thinking about the consequences. Liu Sandow approached him, handed him his ID card, and looked at him with a sincere look, explaining that he was telling the truth. He didn't know what his parents were thinking when they gave him that name, but he wasn't fooling him. Jean took the ID card, looked at it closely, and saw a picture of a girl. Plump asked Liu Sandow if she was sure she was the same person in the photo. She held her hair, pretended to have 2 pigtails, puffed out her cheeks and explained that the photo had been taken 2 years ago, when she had not yet grown or lost weight. Jian, observing his expression, turned his head and started to laugh at the insects. He then faced her with a piercing gaze, saying he still couldn't trust her, as he was unsure about her secrecy. Just before he could complete his thought, she leaped, using a storage ring which summoned a portal with a hand emerging from it. She retrieved a scroll and walked towards Jian with a determined look, assuring him not to worry. Jian looked at the parchment in surprise and asked what it was. She began to open the parchment with both hands and explained that it was an unsealed parchment. Once she revealed the secret, she would be executed. Immediately he was very afraid of dying, and that was why he had taken out the parchment. At that moment a system window appeared informing Jian that she had sworn to protect her secret with her own life. If she revealed the secret, she would be executed. Jian, surprised, could not believe such a thing existed in the world. Several seconds later he took the parchment, closed one eye, examined it with the other, and decided to accept. Now that he had signed the confidentiality agreement, he decided not to kill her just yet. Hearing this, she thanked him. He turned to her and asked her how much the scroll cost. She, with her finger on her cheek, told him that its approximate value was about 10,000. Jian, furious, thought he had used up the only valuable thing he had in the storage ring. She, fearing for her life, offered to take him home, where his parents would reward him. Jian, turning around, began to walk away, explaining that he had to do the night watch, and could not waste any more time. After wishing him luck, she asked him to take her to her house, assuring him that there was a teleportation station nearby and he would arrive on time. Although he refused at first, he finally decided to listen to her. Several hours later, they arrived at the Liu family mansion. The mansion was beautiful and huge, almost like a castle. Inside the mansion, several hooded men bowed before a woman seated on her throne. A man approached him and informed him of what happened to his daughter. She, shocked, couldn't believe it. The Sayo family not only stole and killed, but now they also lied. Unabashedly furious, the woman decided to take action against the Sayo and Sandu family, entered the room, approached her mother, sat next to her, rested her head on her knees, and began to cry. His mother, placing a hand on his head, glared at her subordinates with fury. Her husband approached her, stared at her, and in a serious voice asked her to calm down, since the most important thing was that Liu Sando had returned safely. He also reminded her that the Sayo family was powerful and they could not face them by being simple merchants. Watching En, he was surprised to discover that the girl's real name was Liu Sando. Leo's father turned to Jian, handed him a black card, and with a smile thanked him for saving his daughter. He also asked her not to throw away the card. His mother, with a pleasant smile, told him that he was his benefactor and had prepared a meal for him. Jian, taking the card and smiling, said that he was not going to eat, but his stomach growled and turned red. He decided to eat some. Seeing this, the father pointed to the place where the food was and immediately organized everything, while the mother smiled. The best chefs of the Liu family prepared the meal. Jian devoured several dishes, stacking the one on top of another, a waiter. Seeing this, Xian caught herself with one hand on the table and the other holding a thigh of meat. He thought his appetite increased as the number of insects grew. Liu Sando, sitting next to him, asked him to eat slowly, with a smile. His parents, sitting nearby, watched happily. The mother, enjoying a cup of tea, explained to her husband that her daughter said that Zhong belonged to the creation class and had divine rank. The father, with his hand under his chin, looked at Zhong and explained that, although his daughter did not admit it, he was sure that Jean had hidden abilities and was not as useless as he seemed. Jean was left speechless when Leo's parents started talking about their daughter and he, the mother, with a charming smile, asked her if she had a girlfriend. She added that Liu Sando was also single in her family and that in addition to being a business expert, she was an excellent financial manager. The father, with a mischievously proud smile, added that Sandao's body was very sexy, measuring 36-24-36. She also commented that they made a perfect couple and that she had already thought of men for her future children. Jian, who was drinking a glass of water, dropped it on the table, spat out the water, and was totally stunned. Hearing his parents' proposal, Liu Sandao blushed like a tomato and wondered what was going on. Without thinking twice, Ian ran out, thanking her for her hospitality and apologizing that he was full and had something urgent to do. Seeing this, his father asked him to wait a little longer. They wanted to talk to him. Liu Sando approached his father, covered his mouth with his hand, and asked him to shut up. Her mother, with an expression of disappointment, sat down in a chair. Her father approached her and told her that her son-in-law had left. He added that since his wife had to go say goodbye to him, his mother, approaching Huan, reassured him by assuring him that his father had the location of the black card. Wherever he went, they would follow him. Hearing this, Liu Sandu grabbed his knees with both hands, closed his eyes and shouted for silence. He began to imagine Huan. He thought that although he was handsome and strong, he was also terrifying, and although he was truly terrifying, there was no doubt that he was handsome and strong. Meanwhile, in the Cao Cao Huanchun family, the patriarch received the news that his grandson Kumbo had died. When he found out, he couldn't help but get angry. With a furious look, he ordered his subordinates to investigate the murder in detail. He didn't know who had done it, but he suspected Cao Jiango was behind it, so he ordered his other grandson to send someone to investigate. While one of the men bowed before him, another, named Saudi, with one hand in his pocket, approached his grandfather. He extended his other hand and explained that Kunbu was already over 20 years old and had only reached level 30 of the second transformation, so he was useless. He asked his grandfather what was regrettable about the death of someone useless and told him that it was not worth getting so angry. Cao Juanchun, sitting with his hands on his knees, looked at Saudian and told him that Kunbu was truly mediocre, nothing compared to him, so it was not a pity that he was dead. Besides, he was her grandson. Even to beat a dog you had to look at who its owner was. I wanted to know who in the country had the courage to kill someone from the Cao family. Hearing this, Cao Bian smiled, extended his hand, and began to emit an evil energy. He told his grandfather not to worry about that trivial matter, since after solving the problem of Camp Tangyao, it didn't matter who was to blame. He'd take care of that instead of his grandfather. Meanwhile, Jian reached the Night's Watch office, opened the door, and entered where Zygon and several others were standing. He turned and was surprised to see that Jian had arrived. He began to walk toward them, putting his hand behind his head, introducing himself as they were fleeing. Chen, the new member of the Night's Watch, couldn't help but wonder why there were so many people there. Saigon, he approached him, put his hand on his shoulder, closed his eyes, extended his other hand, and with a smile, told him that they had been waiting for him. Hearing this, Xian was a little surprised. Sigan decided to introduce her to the new key members of her group. The first was Jusa Joke, a level 45 healer in the second stage. She used to be the youngest, but now he had taken that position from her. Hearing this, she put her hand close to her mouth, looked at Jian and couldn't help but blush and think that he was very handsome. It was my first time working with someone so attractive. The second member was Duan Fin, a level 49 archer. Also in the second stage. He didn't talk much, but he was pretty cocky. He put his hand on his hip, the other near his forehead, and with a smile told him that he was delighted to meet him. The third member was Chuba Ilin, a level 49 warrior. Although his body was small, he was strong and very talkative. He approached Jian, stood in front of him, closed his eyes and with a smile explained to him that having a divine level professional member was enough of an achievement to brag about all his life. The fourth member was a woman named Jin, a level 61 third stage Tan Master and belonging to the fire class. He was also a deputy commander. He approached them, put his hands on Chuba Ilin's heads. Jian began to caress them and with a pleasant smile asked them to call her Titan in the future. He assured them they would have meat to eat every day. With a pleasant smile, Jian introduced himself as a humble awakener of the creation class. He asked how she had managed to earn so much enthusiasm from him. He knew that, although it was clear, even at the divine level, the creation class of the spiritual master was not well regarded by people. Jejigan put one hand in his pocket, extended the other, and told him that there was nothing wrong with being of the divine level of the spiritual master's creation class. He asked her not to pay attention to idiots who have no good eye and only talk nonsense. Everyone trusted him. Jaintang put his hands on his hips, turned to him and with a smile told him that he was special because he had chosen to be one of them from the night watch. From now on, that would be his home. Jejigan approached him, put his arm on his shoulder, and decided to talk about the main topic. He extended his hand to one side and looked serious. He explained that if he wanted to enroll in the Tianjiao training camp he had to have a level above 20. He didn't know if Jian had him with a calm look. Jian revealed to him that he was now at level 17. Hearing this, he couldn't help but be surprised to see that he had only changed jobs 3 days ago, and was already at level 17. She grabbed him by the shoulders, closed her eyes, laughed heartily, and thought she had made the right choice. He believed that Jian really had a divine talent, and it wouldn't be difficult for him to rise 3 levels in 3 days. He decided to enroll him in the Tangyao Genius Camp immediately. Jiagigan opened his eyes, looked to the side and saw everyone else looking at him with a serious expression. He put his hand in his pocket, turned to Jian, and with a serious look asked him if he had had any problems with someone very dangerous in the last 3 days, since there was a third-grade teacher investigating his whereabouts using his divine class. He turned his head to one side, looking at the ground, and when he heard that a third-grade teacher was investigating him, he couldn't help but wonder if he could be a family member. "I'm good, guys." Jigan crossed his arms and told Yu Hai or Kei to leave the rest in his hands. Hearing this, she responded with an understanding, then he raised his hands towards the sky, causing a green energy to emanate and form a barrier. He turned his head to one side and explained to everyone that he had placed a protective barrier against espionage around the headquarters so that they could talk freely, without worrying about being spied on. Jian stood still looking at her, asking. Haigen crossed his arms and told Yu Hai or Kei that he left the rest in his hands. Hearing this, she responded with an understanding. Then he raised his hands towards the sky, causing a green energy to emanate and form a barrier. He turned his head to one side and explained to everyone that he had placed a protective barrier against espionage around the headquarters so that they could talk freely, without worrying about being spied on. Xian stood still, looking at her, wondering what kind of power that was. In a matter of seconds, his power began to expand in all directions, making the protective barrier grow larger and larger. Gigan approached Jean, put his hand on his shoulder, closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile asked him if there was anything he was hiding, adding that everyone was there to help him. The others listened dazedly in silence. Qian bowed his head, touched his forehead with his hand, and with a sad look revealed to everyone that yesterday he had killed Xiao Jumbo of the Xiao family. Although he had specifically eliminated the footprints and the body, I was not sure if the Xiao family had other investigation and tracking methods. Hearing this, everyone was shocked. Jin Tang began to look at Jian with a terrified expression and asked him if he had really eliminated a member of the Xiu family. Jigan extended his hand towards him, began to look at him with a surprised expression, and asked him if he had killed Xiu's grandson, Wan Chun, the cultivator who was in the 8th stage of Senrei. Su Weiling couldn't help but be surprised, and began to wonder how strong Jian was to have killed a member of the Qiu family. Jian, touching his head with his hand as he saw their expressions, thought he had caused trouble for everyone now. Jigan mirror Ahian, and explained to everyone that it was well known that the Xiao family had committed many evil acts. The young members of the Xiao family had caused a lot of trouble in recent years. She couldn't help but praise him for doing good by protecting people. She crossed her arms and with a serious look. He remembered that the power of the 8th transformation was certainly terrifying, but as far as he knew, his last grandson was Seo Huan, his most incompetent and least favorite. That being said, was it possible that old Seo Huan Chon wouldn't personally intervene? Jane Tamp, with one hand on her waist, extended the other toward him, and began to look at him with a determined look. He asked him not to worry because if the family sent someone, they, the night watchmen, would protect him, since they were not weak. Xian began to look at Jigan with a pleasing look and couldn't help but smile and feel happy. He was an orphan, and although he had had neighbors who had helped him since he was a child, this was the first time he felt he had a home. Jigan turned his back on him, began to walk away, turned his head slightly towards him, and thought that although Xiujuan was useless, she had probably already reached the 2nd cultivation level. He quickly approached Jian, grabbed him by the shoulders, began to look him in the eyes, and with a surprised expression asked him how he had managed to kill someone at level 30, in the combat class, being a level 17 awakened person in the creation class. Jian got a little nervous, began to sweat, extended his hand towards him and asked him not to get too excited because in reality at that moment, someone had helped him. Hearing this, Jigan asked him who had helped him. Jian put his hand behind his head, closed his eyes and with a forced smile, revealed that the family's 3rd daughter, Liu, who lived in Jianan, had been the person who had helped him. He also added that she had awakened a kind of hidden defense when she heard this. Everyone began to look at Jian with surprised expressions and couldn't help but wonder if he was talking about Liu Sandu, the daughter of the richest merchant family in Jianland. The Liu Gigan family approached Jian, grabbed him by the shoulders. He began to shake him again, closed his eyes and with a pleasant smile praised him, because although the Liu family was not a family of warriors, there was no denying that they were rich. So if Jian ever got into trouble, the Liu family wouldn't sit idly by. He began to look at Hegan, and couldn't help sweating and wondering what he was doing. At that moment, Jian's body began emitting a powerful purple energy several seconds later. Once Hagen opened his eyes, he saw that Jian's body was surrounded by powerful energy. He quickly removed his hands from his shoulders and upon seeing this he couldn't help but be surprised by the sweat dripping down his face. She began to look at him with a surprised expression and remembered that Liu Sandu had awakened the defense class. So he didn't have much attack power, which meant that the person who had killed Yohango was Jian. Jian extended his hand forward and little Nine's poisonous mist appeared in his palm. He began to look at her, revealing to everyone that she was actually an awake person specialized in 2 classes. He revealed to everyone that his other hidden class was poison. Don Feng, who was standing behind him, began to look at him with a surprised expression and couldn't help but wonder what this power was. Jigan tried to shake Jian's hand, asking him how many more secrets he had that he didn't know, but Jian moved his hand to the side because in the palm of his hand was little Nine's poisonous mist and explained that this was very poisonous. Fearing that he could not resist it, the others remained silent, observing this without interrupting. Just before Jian could finish his sentence, Jigan approached him, shook his hand, then closed his eyes and with a smile assured him not to worry because he knew how to defend himself well against poisons. Little Nine's poisonous mist gradually began to make contact with Haigan's hand. Yintang began to stare at his hands, and seeing this, he couldn't help but wonder what this strange poison was. Several seconds later, once Jigan stopped squeezing his hand and removed it, he saw that his hand was already poisoned. Seeing this, he realized this wasn't good. Jian put his hand on his shoulder, closed his eyes and told him that this time he had gone too far. Gradually, the poisonous mist began to spread across his hand. He grabbed her wrist with his other hand, looked at Gianna aggressively, and asked her to stop talking nonsense, since she hadn't even tried to defend herself against the poison in the first place. Hearing this, Jane Tang, who was standing behind him, closed her eyes and began to laugh. Meanwhile, on the other side, Chuck Julin sat down near Jigan's hand and began to stare at her as he wondered what this poison was. Quickly, Jigan turned his head towards where Sajuchi was and asked him to come quickly and help him get rid of the poison. Sayochi, who had a hand extended to one side, deactivated the barrier, causing the energy to slowly disappear. He put his other hand near his mouth, closed his eyes, and while laughing, he zipped back. He reminded her again that I had told her this poison was very strong. He sat down on the couch and while he had one hand resting on his knee, he extended the other where he had the poison to one side. Sayuchi approached him, closed his eyes and with a smile placed both hands close to his hand and using his power, began to heal him. While healing him, he turned his head towards Jian, closed his eyes if with a forced smile he told him that this poison was very good, adding that the more skills he had, the happier Chuck would be. Ulin approached them, placed both hands on the arm of the sofa, began to look at Jian, and watched him in silence. Chuk Ulin approached them, placed both hands on the arm of the sofa, began to look at Jin and watched him in silence. Several seconds later, once Sayuchi had completely healed his hand with a serious look, he began to look at Jin and, even though he was very talented, advised him to forget to enroll in Camp Tanjiao, as it was not good to enroll after what had happened with the Sayu family. Although Camp Tango offered many valuable resources, it was most likely that the Sayu family prodigy would also participate, so they should not laugh at just a few resources. John Tang, who was standing behind him. He put a hand on her waist, closed his eyes, and began to feel to indicate that Gaigan was right. Gaigan began to look at Gaigan with a confused expression, and asked him what he meant by resources. While his eyes were closed, he explained that resources referred to the blood of ferocious beasts, equipment, and other things. If one could be among the first, they would also receive rewards such as mysterious and secret fruits on scrolls. Hearing this, Jigen couldn't help but be shocked, and wondered if what Jigen was saying was true. He began to imagine insects and thought that those resources were much better than going out to hunt fierce beasts, one himself. Although one knew, maybe the insects could breed again. At that moment, while his body was surrounded by the poisonous mist, he began to look at Gigan with a serious expression, and asked him to let him register in the camp, since he was not afraid of danger, he had confidence and knew that he could protect himself. Hearing this, Gigan asked him to wait, as he needed to think about it. At the same time, somewhere in the West Lake, belonging to the Sayu family, there was a temple in the middle of the lake. Someone entered the water and used its power to move it aside, creating a large crack in the ground. This person began to approach the temple. This person was Sayu Bian, the son of Sayu Hita Tansao. Seeing how powerful he was, the others realized that he was the strongest genius in the Sayu family, and his fighting power had reached a new level. While the drops of water from the water fell like rain, the one holding a sword in one hand turned his head back and with a serious look, asked his subordinates to stop talking nonsense and also asked them if they had found what they were looking for. 3 hooded men placed their hands on his abdomen, lowered their heads in front of him, closed their eyes, and one of them revealed that he had discovered that young master Joan Wu had been chasing a woman named Liu. Sandao also added that she had been traveling with someone named Junqin. Well, he slightly turned his head back and with a serious look, he remembered that the family girl, Liu, was not of the combat class. He asked his subordinate who this guy named Huanshan was. The man revealed that Huanshan had awakened a kind of creation of divine rank. Last they knew he'd gone to Nightwish headquarters. One of the men placed a hand on his chest under his head in front of him, closed his eyes, and revealed that they had discovered that he and Liu Sando had registered in the camp. He also added that, however, these 2 people were only suspects, and there was still no concrete evidence. Hearing this he couldn't help but smile. With a penetrating look, he began to look to the side and thought that they were in fact, suspicious. In this crime, a person who had awakened a kind of creation of divine rank was very interesting to him. Knowing that they had signed up for the camp, he couldn't help but feel relieved, since now he wouldn't have to make a special trip and look for them. After 3 days, he just decided to kill them in the camp. At the same time, at Nightwish headquarters, Hyagan and Jian went to his office and sat on the couch. Hyagan, who had one arm resting on his knee, extended his other hand to one side. He began to stare at Gianni, explained that, although he had already registered him in the camp, Tanjiro was still very worried. He had already found a powerful ally among the people registered for him. This person was the little Princess Muanqi of the Mu family, who had a cultivation at the 7th level of transformation, and was known as the Queen of Sealing. Before going to camp, Jian had to accompany her to explore a secret kingdom in which she could not only improve her level, but also establish relationships with her companions. Beforehand, Jian, who was sitting across from him with his elbows resting on the arms of the sofa, simply remained silent listening. Jiagan approached him, took his hand, began to look at him, and with a smile explained that he had heard that Muangi was not only extremely beautiful, but also the same age as him. She would be here soon, so he asked Jian to use his charms to win her over. Hearing this, Jian couldn't help but start to sweat and get a little confused. He forced a smile at Jianggi and said he would try. At the same time, someone started knocking on the office door and Jiangan gave them permission to enter. Muangi and the man opened the door and began to enter. She rested her elbow on one hand, rested her head on the other, and began to look at Jian. She told them that Jian had asked her to accompany someone to a secret realm. The man put his hand behind his head, closed his eyes, and began to smile. She asked Jian if he had changed his mind. Jian told her it was an honor for them to meet her in person. Manhwa crossed his arms and began to look at the ground. Feeling somewhat confused, the man began to touch his head and smile. Seeing this, Jian couldn't help but wonder what was going on. They both stood up. Jiaganga rested his arm on Jian's shoulder, put the other on her waist, and began to look at her, explaining that he had not responded yesterday because he was angry with his grandfather, but today he was willing to accept this, but with a special condition. That condition was that she had to take Jianchen with her. Hearing this, Jian's expression changed drastically. He couldn't help being somewhat surprised and wondering what was happening. Monkey placed his hand on his hip, and as he walked towards them he told them that he had already given him the level 30 Secret Kingdom scroll. After saying this, she asked him if he still wanted to impose more conditions. Jiagan, who had his hand resting on Jian's shoulder, told him that everyone had their own conditions. Hearing this, she thought that he was looking for someone trustworthy to level up with him, since Jian couldn't enter a secret realm below level 50. He concluded that they were looking for her for this reason. The man put his arms behind his back and with a smile began to walk towards them. In it he approached Jian, began to look me in the eyes and asked him what level he was and what kind he had awakened. He began to look at her and in a calm voice explained to her that she was level 17 and had awakened the creation class. Hearing this, she put a hand on his waist. He began to point at Jian with his other hand, looked at him contemptuously, and seeing that he was a level 17 novice of the creation class, he called him trash. Jian couldn't help but get angry and think she was a spoiled child. Jiaganga exploded with rage, clenched his fist tightly and with a hateful look prepared to teach him a good lesson. He called her Hollowhead Girl and asked her to show more respect, since Jian had awakened a hidden divine rank. Seeing this, the other man grabbed him by the waist, closed his eyes, and with a forced smile asked him to calm down, explaining that Moanki's boyfriend had just left her and that is why he was behaving this way. She turned her head back and seeing this she couldn't help but start to feel scared. He thought he had gone too far this time. Jian turned his head to Hyagangi. Seeing her attitude, he couldn't help but be somewhat surprised and confused. At the same time, she became nervous, turned her body towards him, closed her eyes, extended her hands towards him, apologized, and asked him to calm down. Jian began to touch his head with his hand, and thought this situation was strange. The secret kingdom they were going to was called the People of Light. It was level 30, and the entry requirements were that only a maximum of 5 people below level 50 could enter. The conditions to complete this secret kingdom were to eliminate all monsters, kill the boss, or destroy the sacrificial altar. Several hours later they arrived at the portal. Don Fen, who had a hand on his waist, turned his head towards them and with a serious look asked everyone to listen stunned. This time he would be the leader. He asked everyone to remember that if they accidentally separated or were in danger, they should immediately return to this teleportation point. Although the probability of this secret realm becoming unstable was low, precautions had to be taken just in case. Everyone had to return here immediately and leave the secret realm. Monkui, who had his arms crossed, began to look at him with a smile as he listened in silence. His Balin approached Jian, extended his hand towards the portal, closed his eyes and with a smile told him that a level 30 secret kingdom scroll cost at least 1 billion. Saoki, who was holding his elbow with his other hand, also remained silent listening to Monkui, who had his arms crossed, turned his head back and began to look at Jian. She called him a rookie and asked him not to start crying like a baby. After entering the secret realm because it would only delay them, Jian simply started looking at her and remained silent. They all entered the portal. His Belin turned his head back and with a smile asked him not to worry since he would be in charge of protecting him. Who started walking towards the portal, and even though this secret realm was only level 30, it had a strange feeling. Several minutes later they all entered the secret realm. Inside was a green mountain full of trees and grass. In the center was a mysterious village surrounded by snowy mountains. They all approached the summit and Chubule, who was at the end of the group, thought that this village was truly beautiful. He also asked why they couldn't see any monsters. Jian just stood silently watching the beautiful town. Duan Fei, who had his hand on his waist, began to look towards the village and explained to the others that the monsters were probably hiding in the villagers' houses. He decided to search each one individually. After a while, they all descended from the mountain and arrived at the village. As they walked, Duan Fei asked the others not to worry and assigned Chubule the task of attracting the enemy's attention and confronting them, while he would do the damage himself. Little Chi would heal, and Jianchen and Minchui would follow. He asked the two of them not to stay behind. Hearing this, Everyone responded somewhere in the village. There was a rock on which the bright word was written, emitting a strong and evil work. Duanfei, Shaoqi and Jian approached the stone. Duanfei raised his hand to the sky, pointing them to stop. He realized that this stone was suspicious, so he asked them to be careful. Shaoqi, who was standing next to him and holding the magic wand in both hands, explained that he really disliked the atmosphere of this town. He concluded that he had a dark nature. Jian just stood still and didn't say a word. Shaoqi decided to apply a purification bath to the village first. He closed his eyes, extended his hand towards the sky, and his hand began to release blue magic. The bath he had applied began to spread everywhere. Pueblo, who brought his hand to his face, began to look at the magic dust and with a surprised expression, thought that this bath was incredibly powerful, as it not only cleared people's minds, but also significantly increased their attributes and energy. At that moment, the wind began to blow, and a cloud of smoke formed. The sky changed color and turned red, the village lights turned on, and an evil energy began to gather in the sky. They approached and couldn't help but feel surprised and alert at the same time. This evil energy came from the stone. Duanfei quickly realized this and thought it was no good. He turned his head back and with a serious look ordered the others to run just before he could finish the sentence. The stone began to absorb him just before it disappeared. He asked the others to stay away from the stone and also gave them the order to call for reinforcements immediately. Since this was a mutation, a bright light descended to the ground right above the town, creating a magical barrier around it to prevent them from escaping. Several system windows appeared warning everyone that this secret level 30 kingdom, called the Beautiful Town, had undergone a mutation and was now called the Town of the Dead. This secret realm was nightmare level, and the conditions for completing it were to eliminate all the undead in the Town of Light, or kill the final boss. The system left them a note: the light fades, the darkness blooms, and that's when the door to the Kingdom of Death will finally open. The smoke scattered them all. Jean was teleported into a house. As he read the system information, he realized that the secret kingdom had just mutated directly from normal level to nightmare level, and the others had also been dispersed by the mutation. He couldn't help but be surprised as a drop of sweat fell down his cheek. He remembered what Dongfeng had told him: if they accidentally separated and were in danger, they should immediately return to the teleportation point. Jian decided to listen to Duan. Fengyi decided to return first using the teleportation stone. Without hesitating for a second, he approached the wooden wall of the house and kicked it hard, breaking the wooden boards. But instead of finding the exit, he found himself in a room where there were lamps hanging from the ceiling. Coffins on the floor, and on the wall was a picture of an old man. Jian entered the room and after looking carefully, he realized that there was no exit, only coffins. Seeing this, he couldn't help but feel a little confused. The old man in the photo began to look at Jian and began to smile. He began to wonder if this was an illusion. He didn't know why the old man in the picture was smiling at him. At that moment, the lid of a coffin began to open and someone with sharp claws began to emerge. Hearing the sound of the coffin lid, Juan turned his body towards the noise and, with a confused expression, began to wonder what was happening. Several necromancers opened the coffins and emerged. They began to look at Jian. According to the system, they were level 30 and had abilities such as charging, decapitation, corrosion, among many others. Their main characteristic was that they were immune to normal physical attacks. The necromancers began to approach quickly. Jiani prepared to attack. Seeing this, he assumed an offensive stance, raised his hand, and his hand began to release the poisonous mist of Lido Line as he watched as the necromancers slowly approached with a serious look on his face. He thought that if normal physical attacks had no effect on them, it was better to use poison. Just before the necromancers could make a move, who moved at incredible speed, releasing the poisonous mist of Lido Line in the process. In a matter of seconds it began to spread across the room. After doing this, he left the house, jumped and landed on the roof of another house. Within minutes the necromancers were out of the house unharmed, as if nothing had happened. He stood, began to look at them intensely, and thought that indeed, poison was also considered a physical attack, which had little effect on necromancers. To deal with them he needed the help of a wizard. He had to find a way to meet Sayoki as soon as possible. While he was lost in his thoughts, Little Nines manifested himself. She clenched her fists and brought them closer to her chest. He began to stare at the necromancers hungrily. She opened her mouth and as saliva dripped from it, she asked if she could eat them. Seeing that she had appeared and wanted to eat necromancers, he couldn't help but be somewhat surprised. With a confused expression, he asked her if she would be able to devour necromancers. He also added that devouring was also considered a physical attack. The necromancers began to approach the house while the body of Leto, the Nini, was surrounded by a powerful work. He began to look at them and explained to Jian that he would be able to eat them. They were delicious to her. Jian began to look at the necromancers and gave him permission to eat them, but also asked him not to try too hard. If she was in trouble, he would help her escape. Upon hearing this, she gained momentum and with a murderous look began to advance towards the necromancers, thinking that they were simply food. Jian, who was standing on the ceiling, began to watch her and couldn't help but think that she was impressive. Just before the necromancers could make a move, Leto Line began to move at incredible speed, cutting through their bodies, cutting them into pieces and devouring them in the process. She sat down on the floor, brought her knees together, placed her hands under her cheeks, closed her eyes and with a smile began to enjoy the food and feel like she was in heaven. They were very delicious to her. Seeing this, he could no longer help but be amazed. Qian began to look at her with a surprised expression, and remembered that she came from the abyss, so she was essentially like an undead, both belonging to the darkness. Now that he had divine evolution, she could grow into the Lady of the Abyss, whose essence completely surpassed these necromancers. Remembering this, Hu stretched out his hands towards the necromancers, and at that moment his body began to emit the poisonous mist of Leto. Nine began to look at her and smile because she was capable of devouring necromancers. He decided it was time for the other bugs to come out too and enjoy a good meal. Jean's body began to emit a powerful energy, releasing the swarm of insects. He ordered them all to separate and also asked them to be careful not to be discovered by their companions. In the blink of an eye, thousands of insects emerged from his body and began attacking the necromancers. The insects began to attack and devour the necromancers. A system window appeared to inform him that his spirit pets had killed 3 low-level necromancers, granting him 15/21 points. Little Nine also started devouring them, getting 4600, while the bugs slowly devoured the necromancers. Another system window popped up and congratulated Jian on leveling up. He went from level 17 to 18, gaining a point on each attribute and 10 potential points. Jian entered the house again, extended one hand to one side, clenched his other fist, began to look at him and couldn't help but smile when he saw that this was too fast. In just a few seconds he had obtained more than 500,000 experience points, and had leveled up. He thought this secret realm was simply a paradise tailored to him. Now that there were no necromancers in the house, he turned his head back and decided to investigate the strange photograph of the old man. Before, the old man was smiling, but now he was terrified and trembling with fear. Hu approached the photo, put his hands on her waist, began to look at her and with a smile asked the old man why he was not smiling. Leto, the 9 manifested itself, began to look at the photo and informed Ian that everything outside had been devoured. He began to point at the photo with his thumb and with a smile, praised Little 9 for having done a good job, asked her to look at the photo and also if she could devour it. Hearing this, she began to look at the photo with a hungry look. Seeing this, the old man became even more frightened and couldn't help but start to tremble. At that moment, the old man's photo exploded into pieces, leaving them in shock. They couldn't help wondering what was going on. A system window appeared. They had successfully frightened the elite level 35 Deathkeeper. As a reward, the system awarded them 87.01 experience points. The pieces of the photo fell to the floor. Jean and Little Nini started looking at the pieces and felt a little depressed. At the same time, somewhere else in town, someone hit a necromancer in the face with a bow. This person was none other than Duan Fen. Several necromancers surrounded him, but he took out his bow, held it with both hands, clenched his teeth tightly, and with a determined look began to swing it vigorously, hitting one of the necromancers in the process. Another necromancer tried to attack him by surprise, but he reacted in time and, using the sharp bowstring, cut off his hand. He couldn't help but feel lucky, as he had a longbow as a weapon, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to deal with these undead creatures. He began to worry about others, especially Huang Chen, who wasn't even level 30. If something really bad happened, he didn't know how he would explain it to his boss. While he was lost in his thoughts, a system window appeared in the sky to inform him that his teammate had killed a lower-level Wraith and a level 35 Elite Guardian. As a reward he got 12,161 points. Don Fame raised his head, began to look at the system window and couldn't help but be surprised. He started shaking and began to question what was happening and who was doing this. A horde of necromancers appeared and began to chase him. He grabbed the bow in one hand and began to run. He gritted his teeth hard and looked serious. He remembered that this was a secret realm that had mutated. I didn't know who was killing so many monsters in seconds. He came to the conclusion that the person responsible could not be someone weak. At first he thought it could be Chubule, but then ruled it out since his physical attributes were very passive. He then thought it could be Sayuki, but also ruled her out since she was a mage who could restrain necromancers, but wouldn't be able to kill them in seconds. He immediately dismissed Jian, since he was low level. He had awakened the kind of poison and growth of all things, which would have no effect on the undead. With a surprised look on his face, he began to look ahead and began to question whether the person who was killing the monsters was Huan Clay. He didn't know if she was that strong, and the necromancers slowly began to approach him. Seeing this, he started running even faster. Now that there was someone on the team who could defeat the monsters, he instantly thought there was time to save the others. He asked John to hold on a little longer. At the same time, somewhere else in town, someone put his hand on the wound on his shoulder. This person was badly hurt, none other than Muan Cray. Behind her was a horde of necromancers chasing her. She was badly hurt, with scratches all over her body as she held the wound on her arm. With his hand, he opened his mouth and began to bleed. I was so desperate because I didn't want to die. She was the only one who had a hidden profession in her family. He still had to participate in the young talent camp and revitalize his family. His hopes for life slowly began to fade. He would soon run out of energy. He couldn't even use his main ability, cult speed, properly. She started crying because she wanted to go home and didn't want to die. At that moment he saw several necromancers fleeing, and upon seeing this he began to question whether it was his teammate who had just killed the undead. He started walking even faster, and several seconds later he reached the end of the alley. At that moment, the poisonous fog crime L9 began to appear from the corner. Seeing this powerful energy, she couldn't help but be somewhat surprised and feel relieved, thinking that she was saved. He only had to hold on a little longer, but unfortunately his strength was completely exhausted, causing him to fall to the ground. While I had both arms leaning on the floor, he closed his eyes, and as blood dripped from his mouth he thought this was not good. The necromancers began to approach her, preparing to attack. Seeing this he panicked, extended his hand forward, and with a desperate look began to ask for help. At that moment Jian appeared, and with a serious look he began to look at her. When he saw that the person from whom the necromancers were fleeing in, Jian could not help but be surprised. She began to extend her hand towards him, and with a surprised look she couldn't help but wonder what was happening and how it was possible that he was so strong. The necromancers began to approach her and prepared to end her life. With her last breath of strength, she reached out her hand to Jian and asked him to save her. Jian turned his head towards her, and with a serious look, began to observe her in silence, immersed in deep thoughts. Several necromancers grabbed Monclay's arm, but at that moment Jian also grabbed it and told him to run. She looked at his arm with a confused expression, and couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Using all his strength, Jian pushed Monclay aside and threw her back, saving her from the onslaught of the Negromantis. As Jian extended a hand behind his back, he looked intently at the necromancers and asked Monkey to step away from there and stop interfering. She started to run backwards, but suddenly she tripped and fell to the ground. Several seconds later, with one hand on the floor, he began to sit up and wipe his face with the other hand. With one eye closed, he began to look at Jian with the other and thought that Jian Chen was crazy. A purple energy seemed by. Seeing this, his expression changed drastically. She couldn't help but be surprised and began to wonder what was going on. Jian extended his hand towards the necromancers, releasing a swarm of insects that quickly advanced towards them and began to attack them, tearing their bodies to pieces. Muan Gray, standing behind Jian, couldn't help but think he was very handsome. In an instant, the insects killed and devoured the necromancers completely. As Jian's body released Little Nin's poisonous mist, he remained silent. Muan Koi placed both hands on the ground, sat down, began to look at Jian, and couldn't help but wonder if he was really a useless person from the creation class. Gi Hagen had told him that he had 2 classes, and he quickly realized that this was his true power. He put his hand over his mouth, began to blush, and looked at Jian with a loving look. Her heart was beating very fast, which meant she was in love. 30 minutes later, the others finally got rid of the necromancers and gathered somewhere in town. Chuck Julink placed both hands on his knees, began to breathe heavily, and couldn't help but think that necromancers were very powerful. Duan Fen began to touch his head with his hand, and with a confused look he thought this was very strange, since he had not encountered another necromancer since he had left that house. Shaoki, who was holding the magic staff with both hands, turned his head towards them and asked Duan Fen if it was possible that Duan Craig had the ability to control necromancers. Nor did they know if she had awakened any occult class, which was also very strange to her. He began to point to the side with his finger and with a surprised look, attracted the attention of the others and informed them that there were traces of a fight, which meant that the battle was over. Recently. Chuck Yulin started to look in the direction she was pointing and couldn't help but feel a little confused. Don Fen also began to look, but he was more worried about Jian, since he didn't know if he was okay. Not far from them lay some remains of the necromancers covered in the poisonous fog of Leto. The 9 approached the area and Shioki, who was holding the magic staff in one hand, was speechless when he saw that these were actually remains of the necromancers. Duan Fen couldn't help but panic. He asked the others to quickly look for Jian, since if anything happened to him, none of them could take responsibility. After this, the 3 dispersed around the town and started looking for Jian. Several minutes later they began to follow the tracks and turned a corner. When they saw what was in front of them, they couldn't help but be surprised. Don Feng was in shock, he couldn't believe what his eyes were seeing. Shaoqi was somewhat surprised and began to wonder what was happening in front of them. There was a street with small stairs and on these stairs Jian sat, with both elbows on his knees and his head supported by his hand. Next to him was Muan Craig. He clenched his fists tightly and sat behind him and began to massage his back. Near them, on the ground, were more remains of the necromancers. Their teapot, which was behind them, asked Don Fen if that was Jin. Shaoqi began to point at the sky with his finger and with a surprised look told him that it was indeed Jian Donfine. He started looking at Jian with a confused expression and asked the others not to move because this was too strange. He didn't understand how a king's granddaughter could be massaging Huangchen like a servant. He came to the conclusion that these 2 were probably illusions created by the head of this secret kingdom, Muan. Trey clenched his fists, stepped behind Huan, and began massaging him. They both looked forward and gave Huan Fen and the others. Seeing that they had arrived, Huan stood up, pointed to one side with his thumb, and explained that the chief was in the village's backyard. Far from being relieved, they took an offensive stance. Don Feng drew his bow and with a serious look ordered them not to move. Rain and Link clenched both fists and prepared to attack. Shaoqi held the wand tightly, looked at Jian, and asked him to answer the question they were going to ask him first. Hearing this, Jian and Monkey couldn't help but feel a little confused. She got up, stood in front of him, extended her hands to her sides, looked at them with a serious look, and told them that if they wanted to hurt Jian, then they would have to pass over his corpse first. Chan began to look at her with a confused expression, and couldn't help but wonder what she was doing and why she was behaving that way. Chan put his hand on her face, pushed her aside, stood in front of her, closed his eyes, put the other hand on her chest, and with a smile explained to Don Fen that he knew what they were thinking. He revealed to everyone that he was no monster, just a little more charm. They didn't answer and seeing this he told them that his boss was called Hia Gengi, and that Aunt Tan cooked very well. Xiaoqi approached him. He placed both hands on his chest and asked him if he was injured. He began to touch his head with his hand, closed his eyes and began to smile. Her teapot couldn't help but feel relieved to see that it really was Jian and that he wasn't hurt. John Feng on the other hand, remained somewhat confused. Montre, who was hiding behind Jian, grabbed her cloak with one hand, and while blushing like a tomato, asked the others not to be angry with her because she was only being obedient. Jean turned his head towards her, and with an angry look, he asked her to tell the truth and stop lying. Hearing this, Xiaoqi was a little surprised, since she didn't expect this from him. Don Fent began to smile and thought that he really had skills for winning women. His teapot also began to smile, and he thought he had no choice. Jean began to feel overwhelmed and with a cry told them that enough was enough. He also asked them if they didn't want to defeat the chief. In response, the others began to smile and changed the subject to say yes. Sometime later they arrived in the backyard of the town with a determined look, took a strong kick on the door while the others simply remained silent, opened the door and began to enter the backyard. In front of them was the head of this secret kingdom, who was giant and had a murderous look in his eyes. He lowered his head slightly and began to stare at Jian. A system window appeared and informed everyone that this boss was called the God of the Undead. He had the rank of boss and was at level 40. Jian raised his head and began to look at the boss, contemplating everyone. They began to look at the boss and couldn't help but be surprised with a serious and determined look. Don Feng revealed to them that this was the level 40 boss. He also asked them to be careful, as he will attract their attention. He first assigned Muankre the task of protecting Jian. He also asked Xiaoqi not to forget to use the Baaf and advised him to be careful of the boss's attacks. They couldn't be reckless, they had to try to ensure their own safety. While they attacked, they had to be very careful because this wasn't a game. The boss just started looking at them and stayed in, and several seconds later started moving. Seeing this, Don Feng asked the others to be careful, as he was moving, and also ordered them to separate. But to everyone's surprise, instead of attacking, the chief bent down, rested his elbow on the ground, and prostrated himself before them. Leaving everyone in shock, the boss's body and began to tremble. Don Feng, who was Tony Toby, with a surprised look, began to wonder what was happening. His teapot was also astonished. He was astonished because he didn't know why the boss was begging. "Excuse me." Jian took a step forward, extended his hand towards the chief, and his body began to emit the poisonous fog of Leto, the Nine. Everyone was hurt, so he decided to take care of the boss. He knew this was a good opportunity, so he called Little Nine and told her it was time to eat. In the blink of an eye, Little Nine manifested in the form of Mother Insect, opened her mouth and prepared to devour the boss. He raised his head, looked to the side, and when he saw this he couldn't help but be surprised. Little Nine began to devour the boss, while Hu simply remained silent and began to smile. Several system windows popped up. He had killed the boss, called God of the Undead, and as a reward the system granted him 76,690 experience points. Little Mine also transferred her 31,224 experience points to him. Thanks to the experience points, he went from level 25 to level 26, every one of his attribute points improved, and he also got 10 potential points. In the blink of an eye, she completely devoured the boss, and her poisonous mist began to return to Jean's body. Another system window appeared and congratulated everyone on defeating the boss and completing the secret kingdom called the People of the Undead. The system began to calculate the reward when it saw that Jian had defeated Chief Duan Fendi, and the others quickly realized that he had also instantly killed all the necromancers in the village. Jian put his hand behind his head, closed his eyes, and with a forced smile, explained to them that it had been a coincidence that his poison could eliminate necromancers. The system finished calculating the rewards and an issue status window appeared. Don Fend, who was at level 49, received a rank evaluation SE. His bully, also level 49, received a rank evaluation from Xiaoqi, who was at level 46, received a rank evaluation from Montrey, who was at level 36, received a rank evaluation EY, finally Xian, who was at level 26, received a rank evaluation SSS. A medal appeared in the sky and everyone was surprised to see it. They had successfully cleared the secret kingdom, called Undead Town, which was level 30 and had a nightmare difficulty. The evaluation of the system was SSSI rank. As a reward, the system awarded them the Dead Soul Medal, a special item that could be equipped and withstand a deadly attack. It was an object already linked to them and could not be transferred or sold. Don Fame couldn't help but be amazed, as the individual bounty items were already quite good and now they had also obtained a very advanced item. They had never received rewards like this before, all thanks to following Jian. They had won without doing anything. They approached Jian, put their hands on his knees, bowed their heads towards him, and thanked him. He put his hand behind his head and began to laugh. Jian, who had been the best, got many rewards. Among them were 2 books, a metal glove, a parchment, a crystal, a scythe, a necklace, a ring, and a shield. He crossed his arms, and as he looked at the objects, he thought it was no wonder this was a level 30 secret realm. The mortality rate was too high. He quickly came to the conclusion that these objects must be worth billions. Among the objects was one that caught his attention a lot. This object was called Invisibility Cloak. It was platinum quality and could grant 80 agility points and 50 energy points to the user. By using this layer 1, it could become invisible for 3 minutes with a cooling time of 2 hours. Hu extended his hand towards the invisibility cloak and with a surprised look decided to keep it. For him, this cloak was practical, useful and fashionable. The other items weren't going to be of much use to him, so he decided to sell them when he got back and buy pure blood for the bugs. A portal appeared in the sky along with a system window due to the mutation in the secret kingdom and having completed the challenge. This secret kingdom was about to disappear, so the system asked everyone to leave as soon as possible. This time the devouring value had increased a lot, so if the insects drank a little more blood, they could reproduce a second time. Night fell and they returned to the Night's Watch headquarters. Hyegan was informed that the secret kingdom had mutated, that Jean had conquered Montre, and that he had also been the one who had cleaned up the secret kingdom. Hearing this, Hyegan couldn't help but be surprised. He asked everyone to leave the office, as he wanted to speak alone with Jian Dongfeng, who was behind Jian. Several minutes later, when everyone had left, Jian entered the office. Jiang Jigan turned her body towards him and with a serious look asked him to confess and be honest, since in this way he would be treated with leniency, but if he resisted, then he would be severely punished. Jian felt a little confused and in a trembling voice asked him what he meant by being honest. Jiajigan began to meet his eyes. He had told the others that the poison class could counteract necromancers, but Jiajigan knew that this was just an excuse to deceive Huan Fen and the others. He knew Jian was teasing him, while Jiajigan's eyes sparkled with a sinister look. He asked Jian to tell the truth and also asked him who he really was. Jian began to look at him with a confused look and couldn't help wondering what was going on. She began to sweat and Lito, the Nine, manifested itself in her consciousness, also terrified. He didn't know if the bugs were about to be discovered, they were an ancient celestial plague and if people discovered their existence, he didn't know if they would forgive him. Jia Jigan approached him with a sinister look and asked him to speak. Seeing his expression, Jian couldn't help but feel fear and began to tremble with a last sentence. He tried to explain what had happened when he saw that Jian was very frightened. Jia Jigan calmed down and began to smile. She approached him and, with one hand on his hip, placed the other on his shoulder. He closed his eyes and began to laugh out loud when he saw Jian getting nervous too. He didn't know where his courage had gone. When he killed the monsters in the secret realm, Xian started sweating like crazy. He began to look at Jiagan and soon realized that he was kidding him. He sat down on the couch and, with one arm resting on it, extended his other hand toward the ceiling. With a calm look she explained that she wasn't kidding him, just that if she didn't want to talk now, then she didn't want to continue pressuring him either. The more cards Jian had up his sleeve, the happier Hian Yigan would be in the future. Nightwatch would count on him to achieve new successes. Jian finally calmed down a little, put a hand on his chest, and with a sincere smile asked him not to worry. He decided not to reveal anything at the moment, but in return he was going to get him epic-level equipment. Uncle Gigan closed his eyes and couldn't help laughing. He appreciated Jian's intention, but an epic-level team wasn't easy to obtain. In response, Jian explained that he was serious. Jiajigan decided it was time to get serious. He extended his hand toward the ceiling, making a magic circle appear with a serious look. He thought it was good that Jian had some up his sleeve, but there were some things he needed to clear up. From the magic circle 3 bandaged corpses emerged and fell to the ground in front of Jian. Seeing this, he couldn't help but feel a little confused. He asked Uncle Jiajigan what this was and where those bodies had come from. Jiajigan began to look at Jian and revealed that these guys were at least 3rd-degree teachers of level 60 or higher. There were even 2 4th-grade grandmasters with a level above 90. They were not people to be taken lightly, since any of them was someone even Jiajigan couldn't handle. He was just a body collector. Jian got a little nervous and while a drop of sweat fell down his cheek, he began to look at the corpses and with a terrified expression, he asked Jiajigan if all these guys wanted to kill him. With a calm look, Jiajigan asked him to stop talking nonsense, since these guys had gone to kill Moanju, but they had all been secretly eliminated by his protectors. Jian turned to him, and with a confused look I asked him why these guys wanted to murder Moanju. In response, Jiajigan took out a parchment and while holding it in his hand, asked him to read the contents. Jin took the parchment in both hands, opened it, and began to read. This scroll was a great summer hunting list. First on the list was someone at level 46 named Yin Chang, an invincible descendant who was in the capital's war zone. Killing him would grant heavenly rewards. Second on the list was someone at level 46 named Jia Yasuano, an invincible descendant who was in the Maodu war zone called Shanghai. Killing him would grant 3 heavenly rewards. Third on the list was someone at level 45 named Jian Buzoam, an invincible descendant. He was in the war zone south of the Jans River, called Jianan. Killing him would grant 3 heavenly rewards. The 12th on the list was someone at level 41 called Holly. They saw a National Defender descendant. He was in the war zone south of the Yangtze River named Hanan. Killing him would grant 2 heavenly rewards. Jian didn't know what this big summer hunt list was, they were all names he hadn't heard before. Looking a little closer he noticed the name Saoi Weiyang with a surprised look. He asked Hyejigan if this was not a member of the Saoi family who protected the country. Hyejigan, with a serious expression, said yes. All of them were the most outstanding geniuses in the camp of their generation, and Saoi Weiyang was one of them. He was also going to participate in the Tiangyao camp of the 8 war zones, and Saoi Weiyang was going to be with Jian in the war zone south of the Yangtze River. With a serious look, Hyejigan explained to him that if one was in the 7th transformation, he was considered a protector king, if one was in the 8th transformation, he was considered a protector of the country, and if one was in the 9th transformation, he was considered. Grezia's top 100 prodigies were at least descendants of Manhwa sealed kings, being one of 12 descendants of sealed kings. In Hanan she had only been able to occupy position 77 on the parchment. There was also information about her. A descendant of sealed king was ranked number 77 and was in the Hanan war zone. Killing her would grant a heavenly level reward. Jinjigan began to look at Jian and explained that if the descendants were powerful, much more so would the Soi family, who ruled the country. Several minutes later, Jin finished reading the entire parchment, walked over to Jinjigan, and handed it back to him with a serious look. He asked if I had shown it to him so he wouldn't be so caught off guard in the Chengjiao camp. Jinjigan took the scroll in his hand and replied that yes, the more power he showed, the more danger he would expose himself. He told Jian not to expose himself recklessly, unless absolutely necessary. He clenched his fist tightly, began to stare at the ground with a lost look, and explained that the other geniuses had the backing of great powers. But his uncle Hyejigan, although he had a good teacher, had not learned the arts well and until now was only a 3rd-level teacher. Fearing that he would not be able to adequately protect Jian, he started walking, and told Zhongjigan that he would take this into account, and try not to reveal his power to anyone in Zhongjiao's camp. He began to look at the ground again and thought that Uncle Hyejiga not only did not blame him for hiding his power, but was also making great efforts to protect him. He put his hand to his chin with a smile. He remembered that they said Hyun's performance in the Secret Kingdom had been better than the others. If this was known, then he would definitely be above Moanklio in the rankings. But there was something strange. She hadn't said a single word to anyone since she came back and she was keeping her secret. He got up and, keeping his hand on his chin, approached Jian. She began to look into his eyes with an insinuating look and a smile. She asked him to be honest, asked him what he had done to Moanqiu. He remembered that there were only necromancers in the secret realm. He thought Jian's tastes were really strange. Hearing this, Jian began to look at Jiangjigan with a confused expression, and couldn't help but start sweating to stop talking about the topic. He quickly turned his back on him and as he walked away, he began to wave goodbye with his hand and explained that he was going to shower and then sleep because he wanted to rest a little. With a confused look, Jiangjigan told him he hadn't said that was a bad thing. Several hours later it began to get dark and Jian returned to his apartment. In front of him was a table with a stack of bottles. He placed both hands on the table and with a cheerful look began to contemplate the jars. He had purchased 33 units of 3rd-tier blood and 14 units of 4th-tier blood. I had sold most of the equipment to get this. This should be enough for the insects to reproduce in the 2nd generation. He took a jar, removed the lid, began to pour the purple blood into his arm and with a smile asked the little insects to come out. Since it was time to eat, he decided to start with the 3rd-tier refined blood first. This was equivalent to devouring a master of 3 human transformations with a level above 60. To extract just 1 bottle required ferocious beasts. He told the bugs that his father had worked hard for this. Little Nine soon smelled the scent of blood, manifested herself, climbed onto Jian's head, began to look at his arm with a hungry look, and explained that she too wanted to eat. As the blood floated around his arm, he began to look at Little Nine with a cheerful expression and asked her not to eat now, as there was still a long way to go before she could reproduce. Hearing this, she became sad, grabbed Jian's hair with both hands, closed her eyes, and began to cry like a little girl. Seeing this, he couldn't help but feel a little confused. He grabbed it in his hand, pulled it off his head, and tossed it onto the table on top of a jar. He closed his eyes and although he didn't want to at first, in the end he also let her eat. She removed the lid from the jar and with a hungry look thanked him by telling him that he was the best. He removed the lid from the jar, inserted a straw and began to drink. I was at level 18 and was in the process of going up to level 19. While she drank, John took another jar of blood, removed the lid, and started pouring the blood into her arm again. This was level 4 blood, equivalent to a level 90 or higher human grandmaster. Smelling the blood, the insects emerged from his body and began to drink the blood. A system window appeared and reported that the breeding process of the 9-winged miasma insect larvae had begun. Each insect could reproduce a total of between 40 and 60 larvae. The divine evolutionary acceleration was in progress. More insects came out of his body and began to drink the blood, and several minutes later another system window appeared to report that the insect reproduction process had been completed. There were now a total of 100,000 descendants. At that moment, Jean's hand began to release Lito's poison. The 9, which was made up of insects, began to look at his hand, and seeing this, he couldn't help but feel something. Confused by a surprised look, he became alert, and began to wonder what was going on. Several seconds later, insect larvae began to emerge through his hand. He grabbed her hand to keep the insects from escaping, but it was in vain. The 100,000 insect larvae emerged and began flying around his apartment, devouring everything in their path. Hu began to look at the ceiling, and seeing this could not help but panic, and thought that the insects were revealing themselves. He clenched his fist tightly, extended it towards the ceiling, clenched his teeth tightly, and gave the order to all the insects to return to the insect nest and stay still, since he had not asked them to leave. The bugs began to enter his arm and returned to the bug nest. Looking to the side, he saw that the insects had begun to devour everything. They had devoured the painting and part of the table. He soon realized that insects were terrifying and it was dangerous to let them out while he was at home, since they were capable of destroying everything. On the table lay Lito, the 9. She licked a jar of blood and enjoyed every drop with an expression of anger. Jian scolded her for thinking only of eating instead of caring for her mischievous offspring. He turned his head to one side and his stats window popped up. He was currently at level 26, had the identity of Insect Sovereign, the profession of creation of divine rank, and his talents were growth of all things, level 1, divine evolution, level 1 and 1, ancestral tree. Litoline's stats window also appeared. She was a level 21 insect mother, known as 9 miasma wings. It was disaster level. It had a lineage of 100,000 units, and its combat power rating was 197 stars. Seeing that she had a combat power of 197 stars, he could no longer help but feel cheerful and start smiling. This had improved too fast, almost at the level of a third-level teacher. While his body was surrounded by powerful energy, he clenched his fist tightly, and thought everything was ready. Now all that remained was to wait and go to Tianzhou camp tomorrow to reach level 30 at once, and complete the second reproduction of Litoline. Jian began to imagine the sexy little Nine, and with a happy expression, he thought that at that moment he was going to be able to get a new insect mother. At the same time, Jin Tank returned to the Night's Watch headquarters with a surprised expression. I asked Jiang Yigan if he wanted me to find Tan Dao Wang to intervene. I didn't know if it was necessary to make such a fuss about Huang Cheng. Jia Jigan was sitting across from her on the sofa with one hand resting on the arm of the sofa. He put the other under his chin and explained that he was doing it just in case. He knew that in the war zone south of the river, Jian would meet the prodigy of the Cao family. Well, the most dangerous thing was that there were no secrets that could be hidden in Tianzhou camp. He began to look at the ground, and with a sincere expression, he explained that there was something about Jian that terrified him. I was worried about Jian's poison. I knew he was hiding many secrets from them. With a serious look, she began to stare at Jia Chigan. She couldn't believe that this was possible, and she also asked him not to. It scared her, and she began to remember what had happened a long time ago. 600 years ago, the Devourer caused riots and the Great Sea created the forbidden professions. Once discovered, users of forbidden professions were eliminated directly. He stood up and with a look full of terror, explained to her that if they ran away, Chen really had a forbidden profession. Then she would reveal herself at the moment of awakening. She believed that Huya Jigan was just being paranoid. Chia Lagan clasped her hands. He began to look at the ground with an expression full of terror, and thought that he hoped it would be like she said, that only he was making paranoid. Qian left his apartment the next day and went into the woods. He took out a map, held it in both hands, and as he looked at it, he began to wonder what the right path was. He wasn't sure if he was lost again. At that moment, someone shouted for help. Jian, who was trying to find his way, began to look back and with a confused expression, wondered who was shouting. Behind him was a giant tree, and on the ground, next to the tree, was a sword. At the top of the tree, A white-haired man clung to a branch asking for help, because he was afraid of heights. Jian turned, looked up, and when he saw the man he thought silently. She decided to help him, extended her hand towards him, and used the ability called, Growth of All Things, vid. As he did so, several branches emerged from the ground and began to advance towards the man just before he broke free from the trunk and fell from the tree. The branches wrapped around his body, preventing him from falling several seconds later. The man finally landed on the ground, put both hands and both knees on the ground, and panting heavily explained to Jean that he had been quite frightened. I just wanted to save a bird's nest. He thought the nest wasn't that high, but as he climbed he realized it was really very high. Jian approached him, looked at him, and while a drop of sweat fell down his cheek, he remained somewhat confused to see that the man was afraid of heights, but still decided to climb the tree to save a bird's nest. I didn't know if this man was an idiot. The man stood up. He was an older man. He extended his hand towards Jian and with a kind expression, he thanked him for saving him and also asked him what he wanted in return. Jian, who was lost, asked the man if he knew how to get to Camp Tangyao. The man turned his back to Jian as he walked away from him, closed his eyes and with a smile began to ask him to follow him, since he was also going to Tanjiao camp because he had a task there. She put her hand behind her head, thanked him, and decided to follow him. Jian began to follow the man, extended his hand towards him and decided to ask him a little about him. He asked if he was also a job changer. He was somewhat confused, as the man carried his sword on his back instead of keeping it in the system inventory. He started walking in front of Jian and explained that he wasn't really a job changer, just an enthusiast who liked to practice. With the sword, he turned his head towards Jian, looked him in the eyes and with a cheerful smile he explained that when he was young he had no talent, and after failing to change jobs, he struggled and worked hard for almost 10 years, and still couldn't even afford to buy a bathroom in the city. At that moment, he was completely desperate, and ran to the mountains, found a small abandoned hut, climbed on a table and prepared to hang himself, but when he looked to the side he saw a sword. Seeing this sword, the will to continue living returned in him. Since then he began practicing with the sword every day in the mountain. He practiced sword drawing for 20 years and fencing for 30 years, and then, all of a sudden, he had a revelation. He asked Jian if he didn't think it was incredible. Jian, who was somewhat confused, replied that it was certainly something incredible. The man grabbed the sword in his hand, began to look at the ground and asked Jian if he wanted to learn to handle the sword. He knew a special move. Just before he could say the name of the special move, Jian interrupted him and refused. Hearing this, I put the sword away, closed my eyes and with a pleasant smile thought that Jian was a little impatient. He decided to wait for the moment when Jian wanted to learn to wield the sword. Jian began to look at the sky, and when he saw what had appeared he couldn't help but be something. Surprised by a cheerful expression, he asked the man to look, and also asked if that wasn't the Tangyado camp. But to everyone's surprise, the man disappeared. Who started to look around and noticed that the man wasn't there. He was a little confused and began to wonder where the man was. He also thought this old man was too strange. At the same time, in Camp Tangyao, several helicopters began to fly in the sky. There was a receptionist at the entrance and there was a huge line of people in front of the counter. He asked all the geniuses who were going to enter the camp to first form the queue for the search. Everyone would receive an ID bracelet that could not be removed unless one was removed. A dark-haired man began to approach the entrance. After a while it was John of the city's turn. Chu received the ID bracelet and began to put it on his wrist. In this camp, Moan Chu and Liu Sanda were also present. They put their hands to their chests, began to look at Jian with a loving look, and could not help but blush when they saw that he had also arrived at the camp. For Moan Yu, he was her teacher, and for Liu Sandu, he was her benefactor. He couldn't help feeling a little confused anymore, since he didn't know what was happening. Being a benefactor was all right for him, but being his teacher wasn't. They also started fighting with each other. With an aggressive look they began to insult each other. Liu Sandao didn't know why Moan Yu called Jian love. He had advised her many times to read fewer romantic novels so that she wouldn't fantasize meaninglessly about men. Moan Yu replied that he was right, now he really knew what true love was. According to her, Louis Sando was nothing. While the two were fighting, little Nini manifested herself, took out a piece of watermelon, closed her eyes and while eating it, explained to Jian that she was enjoying it. Watching you two fight. Jian remained silent, for this information was overwhelming to him. Jin Sando began to point his finger at her and asked her why she was so close to Jian. For no reason, Manhwa approached him, grabbed his arm. He began to make fun of Liu Sandao and asked him to stop being so narcissistic since he was not following him. According to her, Ian had the last word. Ian didn't say a word when he saw this. Liu Sandao began to point his finger at her, and with a mocking smile told her that he had said it a long time ago, and that it had now come true. Muan Klu began to touch his fingertips, began to look at the ground and explained that Ian was very handsome. Io Sandu approached her, put a hand on her shoulder, closed her eyes and while laughing asked her if they were good friends. Muan Q began to look at her and explained that she felt that now they were best friends and rivals in love could only be considered enemy friends. Seeing this, Jian began to sweat and thought that the girls were very strange. At that moment there was a loud crash, not far from them. Everyone began to look in the direction of the noise and saw a smoke screen as the smoke screen disappeared. Who began to wonder what was happening? Liu Sando began to look more closely and realized that someone was fighting. The same man we saw at the entrance to the camp appeared, began to roll up his sleeves, gritted his teeth tightly, and with an aggressive look began to ask who was fighting. Not everyone had entered the camp yet, and someone was already fighting. I didn't know if this person was looking for death. Jian, who was behind him, began to stare at him and realized he was the patrol instructor. I didn't know if the instructors were third-tier strength. The instructor approached the scene of the fight, but someone punched him hard in the stomach, causing his body to be thrown backwards. Seeing this, he couldn't help but be shocked. The instructor's body was thrown back and fell to the ground. He put his hand on his chest, opened his mouth and while bleeding, he gave the order to the others to notify the superiors, as this was getting out of control. Liu Sandao was speechless when he saw that a third-level teacher had been thrown into the air in 1 second. With a surprised look, he began to wonder who had hit the instructor. Seriously, Muan Crew revealed that they were the standouts of Hendman's war zone, a red-eyed woman dressed in assassin's clothes. He appeared, put his hand on his hip, began to observe the instructor and remained in his name. It was Tangjin, an assassin whose strength was extremely terrifying. She was the youngest assassin in Tianjiru, and was said to have recently murdered a level 4 Grand Master in the Akura country. Another red-haired man appeared, his body surrounded by a powerful energy. She started looking at him and couldn't help smiling. His name was Bifengi. He was known as the Little God of Death, a disciple of the Commander-in-Chief of the East Sea Defense Line. He was the brightest and most promising seed in the military district, but he had psychological problems. He tended to lose control easily and become a demon. Another blue-haired man appeared, extended his sword towards the sky, began to look at Jian and smiled. His name was Saobayan. His grandfather was one of the 7 guardians of Grazia. He had the other blue's immortal swordsman profession, comparable to a divine-level profession, mess. Sandao gave him a terrified look and told Jian he knew the damn dog. The epic sword in his hand had been stolen from his house. Jian looked at him with a calm look, and seeing that he was Saobayan, he had no doubt that he was a prodigy, since his strength far exceeded that of Sao Yumbu. People didn't know who was being attacked by the 3 together. In the middle of them stood a shirtless man with orange hair. He rose, took an offensive stance, and prepared to attack. As the smoke cleared, he clenched his fist tightly and decided it was time to strike back with a murderous look. He clenched his fist and used all his strength to hit the ground hard. Breaking him into pieces, he was an invincible descendant. His name was Janbuqian. He was said to have 3 professions. All unique and hidden, he was strangely strong, since the 3 together could not defeat him. Montra and I, Sandao, began to look at Boxian with a surprised look, even who was shocked, since Boxian was the 3rd in the summer classification list. I didn't know if his little bugs would be able to stand up to this guy. At that moment, Saobayan gathered momentum, jumped, grabbed the sword in both hands, and prepared to attack. Hu looked up and saw this and thought it wasn't good. Saobayan landed on the ground, gripping the sword tightly, causing the ground to crack. She was very close to Liu Sandao, but fortunately Jian grabbed her hip, jumped and dodged her attack. Saobayan began to look at Boxian seriously, and praised him since his wind fist was very powerful. Jian began to look at Saobayan and caught his attention. Saobayan began to sheath his sword, and when he saw Jian he was surprised. He had heard that he had been the one who killed Sao Huambo. He drew his sword again, began to point the point at Jiani. While his body was surrounded by a powerful aura, he began to stare at him, despite also despising the useless Sol Guambu. Gianni was going to die today. He had originally planned to deal with Buchan first and then deal with an ant like Jian, but since he was here he decided to start with him. Undeterred, Jian reached out his hand to one side, releasing the poisonous mists from little Nian. With a look full of determination, he told her that although their strengths were different, the Xiaolao family was really rotten at its core. Sobayan extended his sword to one side and began to approach Jian. Seeing this, Jian spread both hands to his sides and prepared to attack. Although he had promised Uncle Giegan not to do it now, there was nothing else he could do in this situation, and Lu Sando, who was behind them, simply remained in. Just before the fight could begin, someone threw a powerful cut at them that split the ground in two. This person ordered everyone to stand aside, as the great instructor known as the Heavenly Sword King had arrived upon seeing this. Both Jian and Saobayan deactivated their powers. He began to look in the direction of the attack and couldn't help but wonder who the Heavenly Sword King was. This instructor was the same person Jian had saved from the tree. He extended his sword towards them and with a serious look, explained that if anyone dared to cause trouble before camp began, he would have to face his sword. Jian started looking at the instructor and couldn't help but stay in Soji and start sweating. He couldn't believe that the strange old man he had encountered on the way was the boss called Heavenly Sword King. With just one movement of his sword energy, he had made the four great geniuses tremble until they were motionless. He didn't know if his little insects had also been destroyed by the shockwave of his sword.